75,000 years ago, a volcano erupted with such force that it may have changed the sky, the climate, and the future of early humans. Some researchers have suggested that after this disaster, the human population may have been reduced to a dangerously small number. But the evidence is not simple, and the story is not fully closed. If people survived, where did they survive? If only a small number remained, what did humanity almost lose? And did one ancient volcano nearly kill every human on Earth, leaving only thousands behind? Before the sky changed, before the ash settled into lakes, oceans, valleys, and soil, the human story was already narrow, fragile, and unfinished. The people alive around 75,000 years ago were not living in a world built for them. They were living inside a moving landscape of cold nights, dry seasons, shifting grasslands, forests that expanded and withdrew, coasts that changed with the sea, and animals that moved according to food and water. Their survival did not depend on one great invention or one heroic moment. It depended on small continuities repeated across many days. Finding shelter, keeping close to water, reading the land, sharing food, protecting children, carrying memory from one generation into the next. And yet, even before the Great Eruption, humanity was not a large, secure presence on Earth. Modern humans had already appeared, and their deeper roots lay in Africa, but their numbers were spread unevenly across regions, and their future was not guaranteed. A drought in one place could matter, a failed migration could matter. A vanished group could leave no trace except a silence inside the human family tree. This is why the question of Toba feels so unsettling. It does not begin with the volcano. It begins with the smallness of the people who may have had to face its after-effects. When we imagine the ancient world, it is easy to picture empty space, open plains, dark woodland, rivers under moonlight, coastlines where waves came and went long before cities, writing, farming, or metal tools. But that emptiness was not just visual. It also describes the scale of human life. Groups were small, distances were large. Communication between faraway communities was limited by walking, terrain, hunger, danger, and time. If one band disappeared, another group hundreds of miles away might never know. If a valley dried out, there was no stored civilization to absorb the shock. There were bodies, memories, tools, relationships, and paths through the land. That was the human world before the sky changed. It was not primitive in the careless sense of being simple. It was complex in a different way, because every useful skill had to remain attached to living people. Knowledge lived in hands, eyes, habits, and stories spoken around fire. A way to find tubers, a safer crossing through rough ground, a memory of animal movement, a method for shaping stone, a habit for keeping embers alive through the night. None of these things existed in books. They survived only if people survived. This matters deeply for the title of this story, because when we ask whether a volcano nearly killed every human on Earth, we are not only asking how many bodies remained, we are also asking how much accumulated human possibility could have been lost in a few broken generations. Before Toba, early humans were already living close to limits set by climate and landscape. The body needed food, warmth, rest, water, and cooperation. A person could endure hardship, but not endlessly. A group could move, but only as far as children, elders, injuries, rivers, cliffs, and hunger allowed. A population could recover, but only if enough people remained, if births continued, if children survived, and if scattered groups did not become too isolated from one another. These are quiet conditions, but they are the foundation of all later history. Long before kingdoms, monuments, writing, or maps, the future of humanity depended on whether small groups could make it through one more season and then another. That is why the world before the eruption must be held carefully in mind. If the Toba eruption truly darkened skies and disturbed climate across wide regions, then it did not strike a world of millions arranged in strong networks. It touched a species still emerging from deep time, a species with intelligence, adaptability, and social strength, but also a species made of vulnerable bodies in small communities. The beginning of this story is therefore not fire from the mountain. It is the human condition before the fire, scattered, resourceful, exposed, and still not certain to become the ancestors of everyone listening now. The people who lived before the Great Eruption were not separate from the land in the way later societies would sometimes imagine themselves to be. Their bodies were part of the weather, part of the distance between water and shelter, part of the slow movement of animals, part of the plants that appeared and disappeared with seasons. A colder year was not a number in a record. It was fewer edible roots, fewer insects, fewer birds, harder nights, longer walks, and children who needed more warmth than the land could easily give. A drier season was not simply a change in rainfall. It could mean a shrinking pool, a silent stream, a path that no longer led to food, or a group forced to move before it was ready. This is important because the story of a volcano nearly destroying humanity cannot be understood only by looking at the eruption. It must also be understood through the ordinary weakness and strength of human bodies before the eruption ever happened. Early humans were adaptable, but adaptation was not magic. A person could remember where water had been found before, but memory could not make rain fall. A group could share food, but sharing could not create food from an empty landscape. People could make tools, carry fire, cooperate, and move with careful knowledge. But each of these strengths still depended on the living body having enough energy to continue. Hunger slows thought. Cold steals movement. Illness can turn a short journey into an impossible one. Injury can change the fate of an entire group when every adult hand matters. In a world of small communities, survival was not only about facing dramatic danger, it was about the pressure of many small limits arriving together. Long before the Toba eruption placed its mark in the geological record, human life already depended on a narrow balance between body, group, and environment. The balance could hold for years, then suddenly become thin. One generation might grow up near reliable water, while the next found the same place changed. One group might know a route through grassland, while another route became blocked by drought, predators, distance, or simple exhaustion. The beginning of humanity was not a straight line moving safely toward the present. It was a set of fragile continuities, many of which did not survive. Most people who ever lived left no name, no grave, no story, and perhaps no descendants. Their existence mattered, but it vanished into the larger pattern of time. That is the quiet background behind the phrase, "only thousands survived." It is not merely a shocking number. It points to a deeper question about how small a human future can become before it almost disappears from the world. Scientists do not all agree on exactly how sharply the human population was reduced, or whether the Toba eruption was the main cause of such a reduction. But the possibility matters because small populations are vulnerable in ways large populations are not. When there are fewer people, chance becomes more powerful. A bad season can remove more than food. It can remove entire lines of descent. A lost child is not only a family grief. In a small population, it is also a future branch that never grows. A group that becomes too isolated may preserve some knowledge while losing other knowledge. A group that moves into a safer place may survive, while another, not far away in historical terms, may fade without leaving a visible sign. Before the sky changed, humanity already carried this risk inside its structure. The species was not yet spread across the entire planet in the dense numbers seen today. Human presence was uneven, local, and exposed to the deep rhythms of climate. The earliest chapters of our kind were written not by one people in one place, but by many small groups whose connections were limited, and whose survival could not be guaranteed. To understand the ancient volcano, we must imagine its possible effects falling onto this kind of world. Not an empire, not a civilization, not a global population able to store grain, send warnings, or rebuild across continents, but living communities whose strength came from memory, cooperation, movement, and endurance. If the atmosphere cooled, if rainfall shifted, if plants and animals changed their ranges, the danger would not arrive as one clean catastrophe. It would pass through stomachs, bones, feet, births, migrations, and silence. The mountain did not need to kill every person directly to become part of a much larger human question. It only needed to disturb a world where humanity was already living close to the edge of what bodies and small groups could bear. The world before the eruption was not waiting for disaster in a dramatic way. It was simply continuing, as living worlds do, through ordinary uncertainty. Children were born into small circles of care. Adults carried memory in their movements. Older people, when they survived long enough, may have held knowledge that was difficult to replace. Where dry ground stayed passable after rain, which plants returned after fire, which animals became dangerous when the season turned, which stones broke cleanly, and which shelters could protect a sleeping group from wind. None of this required cities or monuments to be important. It was important because it kept a fragile human line moving forward. In deep history, survival often looks quiet from a distance. It is not always a scene of chase, hunger, or fear. Sometimes it is a child kept warm through a cold night. Sometimes it is a group deciding to remain near a river for one more season. Sometimes it is the patience of shaping a tool, the care of carrying embers, or the ability to notice that birds have gathered where water still remains. These small acts are easy to overlook, yet they are the true background of the question in the title. If a volcano nearly killed every human on Earth, then what stood between disappearance and survival was not a single heroic answer. It was the accumulated strength of ordinary human dependence. One person on another, one generation on the last, one body on the land. The ancient world also reminds us that the human future did not belong equally to every group alive at the time. Some groups may have lived in places where climate stress was less severe. Some may have had access to coasts, rivers, lakes, wetlands, or more reliable seasonal resources. Others may have lived in harsher settings where a small change could become serious. We should not imagine a single human experience spread evenly across the world. There was no one ancient night shared by everyone in the same way. There were many local nights, many landscapes, many pressures, and many possible endings. This matters because a global phrase like humanity can hide the unevenness of real survival. Humanity did not live as one body. It lived as scattered bodies separated by distance, terrain, memory, and chance. When later scientists look back through genetics, archaeology, climate records, and volcanic ash, they are trying to reconstruct this broken and uneven picture from fragments. They are not reading a complete human diary. They are reading signals left in bone, stone, sediment, DNA, and absence. That is why the story must move carefully. The Toba eruption was real, its ash was real, its scale was extraordinary, but the human meaning of that eruption is not a simple sentence. It rests on how many people existed before it, where they lived, how connected they were, how harsh the climate became, how long the disruption lasted, and how many lines of descent continued afterward. Before we can ask what the volcano destroyed, we have to understand what was at risk. What was at risk was not modern civilization. It was something earlier and quieter, the fragile continuity of Homo sapiens before the world knew what Homo sapiens would become. There were no books to preserve knowledge if people vanished. There were no archives to remember lost groups. There were no maps showing safer regions beyond the horizon. If a community disappeared, much of what it knew may have disappeared with it. If a population became smaller, the future became narrower. If only some groups survived and left descendants, then the human story after that point would carry the shape of survival and loss together. This is the deeper reason the title feels powerful. It is not only about whether a volcano killed people, it is about whether the whole human future once passed through a small and dangerous opening. We are used to seeing humanity as enormous, spread across continents, filling cities, changing rivers, forests, animals, and climate itself. But before the ash, humanity was not enormous. It was still a living possibility. It had language or forms of communication, social bonds, tools, and intelligence, but it did not have certainty. The people of that time could not know they stood near a turning point that later generations would study from far away. They were not characters in a finished story. They were the unfinished beginning. And somewhere beyond their ordinary days, beneath what is now Sumatra, a volcanic system was moving toward an eruption that would leave one of the largest marks of the recent geological past and one of the hardest questions in the history of our species. Far to the southeast of the ancient landscapes where many early human groups lived, beneath the island now called Sumatra, the Earth held a force that no human community could have understood in its full scale. It was not simply a mountain with smoke above it. It was a vast volcanic system, connected to heat rising from deep below, shaped by pressure, molten rock, trapped gases, and time. For long periods, such a system can seem almost still. Forest can grow over it, rain can fall across it, animals can move along its slopes. People, if they passed through nearby regions, might have seen land, water, trees, stone, and sky, not a hidden engine capable of changing the air far beyond the horizon. That is one of the cold truths behind this story. Some of the largest forces in human history were not visible as danger until after they had already begun. The Toba eruption, usually dated to around 74,000 to 75,000 years ago, was one of the largest volcanic eruptions known from the recent geological past. Its remains are not remembered through writing because writing did not exist. They are studied through ash, rock, chemical signatures, lake deposits, marine sediment, and the enormous caldera left behind. A caldera is not just a crater in the simple sense. It is the collapsed space left when a volcanic system empties enough material from below that the ground above can no longer hold its former shape. In the case of Toba, the scar is now partly filled by Lake Toba, a large lake sitting within a landscape that still carries the memory of that eruption in stone. The scale is difficult to hold in the mind because human bodies are built to understand nearby danger. A falling branch, a moving animal, a sudden storm, a cold night, these are threats a body can register directly. But a super eruption is different. Its danger is not only at the place where the mountain opens. It can enter the atmosphere. It can throw ash high into the sky. It can send fine particles across enormous distances. It can influence sunlight, rainfall, plant growth, river systems, and animal movement in ways that may unfold over seasons rather than moments. This is why the volcano beneath Sumatra belongs to the question of whether humanity nearly passed through a dangerous narrowing. If its effects reached far enough, they would not have needed to touch every group directly. They could have changed the conditions those groups depended on. A person did not need to see the eruption to feel a colder season. A child did not need to breathe ash near the volcano to suffer if food became scarce elsewhere. A group did not need to know the name or location of Toba to be caught inside a world altered by its aftermath. Still, the story must be kept careful. The eruption was real, and its geological scale was immense, but the exact human consequences remain debated. There is a difference between saying that a volcano was large enough to affect climate and saying with certainty that it nearly killed every human on Earth. The first claim stands on strong geological evidence. The second belongs to a more difficult conversation, where genetics, archaeology, climate modelling, and local survival evidence do not always point in one simple direction. This makes Toba more haunting, not less. It is not a clean myth of destruction. It is a real event whose human meaning remains partly hidden. Before the eruption, early humans lived within regional worlds, each with its own water sources, plants, animals, shelters, and risks. Toba was not near every one of those worlds, but volcanic systems do not respect the limits of local life. Once enough ash and gas entered the atmosphere, distance could become less protective than it seemed. The sky itself could become the carrier of change. Light could be filtered, weather patterns could shift, ecological stress could deepen in places already close to the edge. And because human groups were small, scattered, and dependent on local knowledge, even modest environmental pressure could matter, if it came at the wrong time, in the wrong place, across enough seasons. The volcano beneath Sumatra therefore stands at the edge between geology and human ancestry. It reminds us that the early history of our species was not shaped only by tools, migrations, and social bonds. It was also shaped by forces beneath the ground, by events that began far below human awareness and rose suddenly into the sky. Somewhere under that island, pressure built inside the earth while human groups elsewhere continued their ordinary struggle to live. They could not know that one eruption would later become a central question in the story of human survival, or that its ash would lead distant scientists to ask whether the future of our species once came much closer to ending than we can comfortably imagine. A volcanic system like Toba does not become dangerous only at the moment it erupts. Its danger is prepared slowly, invisibly, through deep processes that no human eye can watch. Molten rock gathers below the surface. Gas remains trapped under pressure. Heat moves upward through the crust. Rock that appears solid and permanent becomes part of a much longer movement. For many lifetimes, the land above such a system may seem stable. Rain falls, rivers cut through valleys, trees grow, animals feed. The surface gives no clear warning that enough pressure, over enough time, can turn hidden geology into a sky-changing event. This is one reason the Toba story feels so different from ordinary human danger. A predator can be seen, a storm can be heard, a drought can be felt as the water disappears. But the deepest forces under Sumatra belong to a scale outside direct human understanding. They were older than any memory, larger than any group, and patient in a way living bodies cannot be. When the eruption finally came, it released an enormous amount of volcanic material into the world. The exact measurements used by geologists are difficult for ordinary imagination, and the numbers can vary depending on method and definition. But the essential point is widely accepted. This was not a local eruption in the small sense. It was a very large explosive event, one capable of spreading ash over vast distances and leaving a signature that researchers can still identify long afterward. Ash from Toba has been found far from Sumatra, including across parts of South Asia, which matters because South Asia was also part of the broader map of early human movement and survival. A layer of ash in the ground is not merely dust. It is a time marker. It tells scientists that, at one moment in deep history, the sky carried material from a single volcanic event across lands, waters, and ecosystems. For early humans, this kind of eruption would not have been understood as a geological event. If any groups were close enough to see or feel its immediate effects, they would have encountered noise, darkness, falling ash, damaged landscapes, poisoned water sources, frightened animals, and the collapse of familiar patterns. But the more important question for the whole species lies beyond the immediate blast zone. Most humans alive at that time would not have stood near the volcano. Many may have lived far away, especially in Africa, where the deep ancestry of Homo sapiens is rooted. For them, Toba would matter only if its effects travelled through atmosphere and climate. That is where the story becomes difficult and important. A supereruption can send sulfur gases and fine particles high into the atmosphere. These materials may reflect sunlight and alter temperature for a period of time. They may disturb rainfall and plant growth. But translating volcanic power into human consequences is not simple. A large eruption does not automatically mean every region became equally cold, equally dry, or equally deadly. The world is uneven. Winds move in patterns. Oceans hold heat. Landscapes respond differently. A wetland, a coast, a forest edge, a river valley, and an open dry plain would not all receive the same burden in the same way. This unevenness is central to a truthful version of the Toba story. The volcano may have been enormous, but human survival was local. A group did not survive or vanish inside a global average. It survived beside a particular water source, in a particular season, with particular children, elders, tools, injuries, memories, and roots through the land. If ash darkened skies in one region, another region might be affected mainly by cooling or shifting rainfall. If some environments collapsed quickly, others may have continued to provide enough food for small groups to endure. This is why the phrase "nearly killed every human on Earth" must be treated as a question, not as a simple fact. The eruption creates the possibility of a severe crisis, but the evidence has to show how that crisis reached people, how strongly it affected them, and whether it truly reduced the surviving ancestral population to only a small remnant. The physical volcano gives us the first half of the mystery. The human record must provide the second half. In the land around Toba, the eruption would have remade the surface dramatically. Closer to the source, ash and volcanic deposits could bury forests, alter rivers, and erase familiar habitats. Farther away, thinner ash could still matter if it covered plants, entered water, or changed the behavior of animals. Beyond that, atmospheric effects could have brought a quieter pressure, colder air, weaker sunlight, uncertain seasons, and ecological stress. None of these would need to look like a single day of destruction. For small human communities, danger could arrive slowly through hunger, failed movement, poor births, and lost connections between groups. The volcano beneath Sumatra therefore becomes more than a geological scar. It becomes a test of scale, Can an event beginning in one island system reach into the future of a species spread across distant regions? Can ash in the ground, climate signals, and genetic patterns be connected carefully enough to tell us whether humanity once passed through a narrow survival gate? The answer cannot be forced. It has to be built from evidence. But the reason scientists keep returning to Toba is clear. Here was a real eruption of extraordinary size, occurring during a period when Homo sapiens was still a small and uneven presence in the world. Here was a geological event large enough to make researchers ask whether the human future had ever become dangerously thin. And beneath that question lies the deeper unease of the story. The fate of a species may sometimes depend on forces that begin far below its feet, long before anyone knows the ground is preparing to open. To understand why Toba became such a powerful question in human history, we have to hold two scales in the mind at the same time. One scale is geological. It belongs to magma, pressure, ash, sulfur, rock, and the long memory of the earth. The other scale is human. It belongs to breath, hunger, children, migration, shared warmth, broken tools, remembered paths, and the delicate chain through which one generation becomes the next. These two scales do not usually meet in a way we can see. Most days of human life unfold under a sky that feels ordinary, while the planet beneath continues its slower movements. But in rare moments, the deep earth enters the human story directly. A volcano erupts, and what began below the ground becomes part of the air. What began as pressure in stone becomes cold, darkness, damaged plants, changed water, frightened animals, and uncertain movement. This is why the volcano beneath Sumatra cannot be treated as a distant background event. It occurred during a time when Homo sapiens was still living in small, scattered populations, with deep roots in Africa and possible movements into other regions. Humanity was not yet a dense global force. It was still an exposed biological presence, dependent on landscapes it could not control. The frightening possibility is not that every human stood near the eruption. They did not. The frightening possibility is that a single geological event may have changed enough of the world's conditions to place unusual pressure on a species that was already limited in number, reach, and resilience. When ash from Toba travelled far from its source, it turned the eruption into something larger than a local disaster. Ash layers are among the reasons this event can be followed across geography. They allow scientists to connect places that no human at the time could have connected in thought. A layer in one region, a chemical signature in another, a deposit in sediments elsewhere. These are not dramatic in the way a story around a fire might be dramatic, but they are powerful because they survive. They show that the eruption entered the wider world. Yet ash alone does not tell the whole human consequence. A landscape can receive ash and still support life. A region can be stressed without becoming empty. A group can suffer without vanishing. Another group can vanish without leaving an obvious sign. The question is not whether Toba erupted with great force. It did. The question is how much that force passed through climate and ecology into the living structure of human populations. That is where the title begins to open into uncertainty. Only thousands survived. Sounds like a closed answer, but in a careful telling, it is better understood as a dangerous possibility raised by some interpretations of genetic history, not as a simple counted census from the ancient world. No one stood 75,000 years ago and counted the survivors. No archive recorded the names of the living. The evidence comes later, from patterns in DNA, traces in stone tools, environmental records, and the presence or absence of human activity in places touched by ash. Each kind of evidence has its strength, and each has limits. Genetics can suggest that the ancestral population of later humans passed through narrow phases, but it does not always identify one cause with certainty. Archaeology can show continuity in some places, but it cannot prove that every place endured. Climate models can estimate cooling or rainfall disruption, but they are not the same as watching an ancient child survive a hungry season. For this reason, Toba is not a simple story of destruction. It is a meeting point between a real eruption and an unfinished question about ancestry. The volcano matters because it forces us to imagine humanity before its apparent success. Today, the human species looks impossible to erase from the planet's surface. Cities glow at night. Roads cross deserts. Ships move across oceans. Satellites look down from above, but none of that existed when Toba erupted. At that time, the future was carried inside small groups who did not know they were carrying it. If climate became harsher, if food sources shifted, if groups became separated, if births declined, if children failed to survive in enough places, then the human future could have become narrower without anyone understanding the scale of what was being lost. The eruption under Sumatra therefore marks the end of the first large doorway in this story. We have not yet answered whether it nearly killed every human on Earth. We have only reached the point where the question becomes reasonable to ask. A vast eruption occurred. Its ash travelled. Its possible climate effects entered scientific debate. And somewhere across Africa, Asia and beyond, small human groups continued under a sky that may have changed above them, while the species itself moved toward a test whose full shape remains partly buried in ash, sediment, and bloodlines. Ash is one of the quietest forms of evidence in deep history. It does not speak like a tool held in the hand. It does not resemble a bone, a footprint, or a shelter floor where people may have sat close to warmth. It lies in layers, sometimes thin, sometimes buried under later soil, sometimes carried into lakes or the sea, sometimes preserved far from the place where it began. Yet ash can connect distant landscapes with a precision that ordinary imagination cannot. A particle that fell in one valley, another that settled in a lake bed, and another that entered marine sediment may all belong to the same moment when a volcano opened and sent part of itself into the sky. This is why the Toba eruption did not disappear completely into the past. No human writing recorded it. No oral memory can be safely traced back across such an immense span of time, but the Earth kept a record in its own slower language. The ash became a mark, and that mark allowed later scientists to ask where the eruption reached, when it happened, and what kind of world it may have touched. For a story about whether humanity nearly vanished, this matters because the first task is not to imagine danger. The first task is to prove that the event was real, large, and traceable. The ash does that. Across parts of South Asia and beyond, volcanic material linked to Toba has been identified in sediments, sometimes by its chemical signature rather than by appearance alone. This is important because ash from different eruptions can look similar to the eye. To connect one layer to one volcano, researchers must compare the minerals and chemistry inside tiny fragments of glassy volcanic material. In that way, the ash becomes more than grey dust. It becomes a fingerprint left by a specific eruption, a layer in India, a trace in ocean sediment, a deposit in a lake or soil sequence. Each one helps build a map of where Toba's material travelled. That map does not automatically tell us how many humans died. It does not count survivors. It does not reveal fear, hunger, or movement directly. But it gives the human question a physical foundation. It shows that this was not a small eruption remembered, only because modern people made it dramatic. It was a geological event that left marks across great distances. Still, the presence of ash is only the beginning of the evidence, not the end. A layer of ash can mean different things depending on thickness, environment, and timing. Close to a volcano, falling ash can bury vegetation, pollute water, collapse roofs if shelters exist, irritate lungs and eyes, and change an entire landscape. Far away, a thinner layer may be less immediately deadly, though it can still affect plants, water, grazing animals, and movement. In some places, ash may have fallen into environments already under stress. In others, ecosystems may have absorbed the disturbance more easily. The ancient world was uneven, and ash would have entered that unevenness. This is why a careful story cannot simply say, ash fell, therefore humanity nearly died. It must ask how ash interacted with living places. Did it cover food plants? Did it alter water sources? Did it arrive during a vulnerable season? Did it affect regions where humans were present in meaningful numbers? Did those groups continue using the same landscapes afterward? These questions matter because the title is not only about an eruption, it is about the possible narrowing of the human future. The ash gives scientists a timeline. It allows them to compare what came before and what came after. If stone tools appear below a Toba ash layer and also above it, that may suggest some form of continuity in that region. If occupation evidence disappears, the meaning may be more difficult. People may have left, died, shifted locations, or simply left no preserved trace. Absence is not always evidence of extinction. Presence is not always evidence of comfort. The Earth records some things and loses many others. A campsite can vanish. A small group can move without leaving a clear mark. A child can survive in one valley while another valley becomes empty forever. So the ash across the ancient world gives us a strange kind of knowledge. It is solid enough to anchor the story, but incomplete enough to keep the mystery open. It tells us that Toba reached beyond Sumatra. It tells us that the sky carried volcanic material across lands where early humans may have lived, moved, or passed through. It gives the great eruption a date, a spread, and a material reality. But it does not, by itself, answer whether only thousands survived. Instead, it opens the next layer of the investigation. To understand what happened to humanity, we have to look not only at the ash, but at what the ash fell upon. Climate, plants, animals, water, tools, migration routes, and the fragile human groups whose lives may have continued quietly beneath a changed sky. To follow ash across the ancient world is to follow a trail that no living person saw from beginning to end. Near Sumatra, the eruption would have been immediate, violent, and overwhelming. Farther away, the same event became thinner, quieter, and harder to interpret. A place might receive a visible fall of volcanic dust. Another might hold only microscopic glass shards inside a sediment layer. Another might preserve the chemical signal in material carried by wind or water long after the first fall. This scattered evidence is difficult, but it is also what makes Toba so important. It allows scientists to connect separate landscapes into one moment of planetary disturbance. The same eruption can appear in the ground of South Asia, in deep-sea cores, and in other archives of climate and environment. In this way, ash becomes a bridge between geology and the human past. It gives researchers a line across time, before the ash and after the ash. For a story about early humans, that line matters because it lets us ask whether people were present before the eruption, whether they remained afterward, and whether their tools, movements, or habitats changed. But the answer is rarely clean. A stone tool found below an ash layer may show that humans or human relatives used that landscape before the eruption. A stone tool above the ash may suggest that people returned or continued there afterward. Yet the space between those two facts can remain uncertain. Did the same population survive in place? Did another group arrive later? Did people leave during the worst conditions and come back when the land recovered? The ash gives a marker, not a complete human story. This is why the evidence must be read with patience. A layer in the ground can be strong proof of a volcanic event, but human survival is a living process, and living processes leave incomplete traces. The ancient people who moved through these places were not trying to preserve a record for us. They were following water, food, safety, kinship, and memory. They could pass through a region and leave only a few flakes of stone. They could live in a place for generations and still leave little that survives. They could avoid a damaged landscape for a time, then return when plants grew again and animals came back. The ash layer may sit still, but human behavior around it may have been fluid. This matters especially when we return to the central question of whether the eruption nearly killed every human on Earth. If ash is found across a wide region, it proves reach. It does not prove extinction. If human evidence continues above ash in one place, it suggests resilience. It does not prove that all regions were safe. The truth may have been uneven. Some groups endured, some moved, some suffered deeply, and some may have disappeared without leaving evidence clear enough for us to see. The most truthful version of this story must leave room for that unevenness. It must resist both extremes, the simple drama that Toba destroyed nearly everyone, and the simple dismissal that because some people survived somewhere, the eruption did not matter. Ancient survival was not measured by one global result alone. It was measured in local landscapes, each with its own burden. A thin ash fall might be survivable if water remained clean and food systems recovered quickly. A thicker deposit could make familiar ground difficult or useless. Cooling after the eruption, if severe enough in some regions, could reduce plants and animals even where ash itself was not the main danger. The same event could therefore become many different experiences across the human range. This is one reason Toba continues to draw attention. It is a rare point where the Earth provides a visible time marker near an important period in human evolution and dispersal. Around that broad era, Homo sapiens was already rooted in Africa, and some human groups were moving through or living near parts of southern Asia. The ash does not tell us exactly who those people were in every place, how many existed, or how closely they were related to later populations. But it creates a question that can be tested against stone tools, sediments, fossils, genetic patterns, and climate records. Each piece adds something, and each piece also reminds us of how much has been lost. A human group could vanish without a burial. A child who did not survive left no descendant to carry genetic evidence. A tool tradition could continue, even if the people making it changed. A population could survive in one refuge while another line ended nearby. The ash across the ancient world is therefore not just the remains of a volcano. It is a boundary laid down over a moving human world. Beneath it are signs of life before the sky changed. Above it are signs of what may have continued afterward. Between those layers lies the difficult question that the title holds open, whether the future of humanity was merely shaken by Toba, or whether it passed through a narrow and dangerous silence from which only a small part of the human line emerged. The deepest value of the ash is that it prevents the Toba story from floating away into pure imagination. Without it, a tale about a volcano nearly ending humanity could become too easy to exaggerate, too easy to turn into a frightening legend with no firm ground beneath it. The ash gives the story weight. It says that something immense happened. It says that material from Sumatra entered the wider world and left a trace that can still be found after tens of thousands of years. But at the same time, the ash also teaches caution. A trace is not a full explanation. A layer is not a human census. A chemical fingerprint is not a memory of every child, every fire, every shelter, or every group that may have moved away from danger. The ash can show where the volcano reached, but not by itself how the human heart of the story changed. That is why this evidence is both powerful and incomplete. It anchors the question, then refuses to answer it alone. Imagine a landscape where ash has fallen after the eruption. In one place, the ground is pale and unfamiliar. Leaves carry dust. Water may be clouded. Animals may avoid certain areas. People who know the land may find that familiar signs have become harder to read. In another place, the ash is thinner, almost hidden within soil. Yet the season after the eruption may still feel different if cold or dryness changes what grows. Farther away, people may never see ash clearly, but they may live through a change in rainfall, animal movement, or food availability. This is how a volcano can enter human history without appearing as one single event to everyone. It becomes many pressures, filtered through distance. It becomes a burden on plants before it becomes hunger in people. It becomes a change in animal behavior before it becomes a longer walk. For early human groups, the danger of such a disturbance would have depended on timing, location, and the condition of the group itself. A group near reliable water might endure what another group in a harsher place could not. A more isolated group might suffer if movement routes failed. If Toba contributed to a population narrowing, the process may not have looked like a single wave of death. It may have looked like fewer successful births, fewer children surviving to adulthood, more abandoned paths, more broken connections, and more local endings that never became visible. This is where the ash meets the silence of prehistory. It gives us a before and an after, but the living passage between them remains partly hidden. When scientists study Toba, they are studying how a large natural event may or may not have passed into the biological future of Homo sapiens. The ash layers help define the moment. Archaeology asks whether human activity continued across that moment. Genetics asks whether later humans carry signs of a reduced ancestral population. Climate studies ask whether the eruption was capable of producing enough stress to matter across large regions. None of these approaches can carry the full answer alone. Together they create a careful picture, and the picture is not as simple as the title might first sound. The eruption may have placed serious pressure on some ecosystems and some human groups. It may also have been survived by people in several regions, leaving continuity where an older, more dramatic theory once expected collapse. The truth may sit between disappearance and dismissal. It may be a story of severe stress, uneven survival, and a human future that remained alive because some groups endured. By the end of the ash trail, we are left with a clearer mystery. The evidence in the ground does not allow us to pretend the eruption was small. It also does not allow us to count the survivors with certainty. What it gives us is a boundary in deep time. On one side were scattered groups living under ordinary uncertainty. On the other side were descendants who carried the human story forward. Between them fell ash from a volcano beneath Sumatra, and beneath that ash remains the unresolved question of how close the human line came to narrowing beyond repair. A darker climate is one of the most unsettling possibilities in the Toba story, because it moves the eruption beyond one island and into the breathing world of many places. A volcano can destroy land near its source with ash, heat, and force, but climate is different. Climate can travel without footsteps. It can reach people who never saw the mountain, never heard the explosion, and never knew that the cause of their harder season began far away beneath Sumatra. When a very large eruption sends sulfur gases and fine particles high into the atmosphere, some of that material can reflect sunlight back into space. Less sunlight can mean cooling. Cooling can mean weaker plant growth, altered rainfall, colder nights, and changes in the animals that depend on plants and water. For small human groups living without farming, stored food, roads, or written records, these changes would not be abstract. They would be felt through the body. A colder night meant more energy spent staying warm. A poor season meant longer searches for food. A shift in animal movement meant familiar paths no longer worked. A shrinking water source meant the distance between life and danger became wider. This is why the idea of a volcanic winter became so closely tied to the question in the title. If the eruption darkened the sky for long enough, and if the climate changed strongly enough across regions where early humans lived, then Toba could have become more than a local disaster. It could have become pressure on the human future itself. But this is also where the story must slow down. A darker climate is not the same thing as a simple ending. Large eruptions can affect climate, but the size, duration, and geography of those effects are difficult to reconstruct after such a long time. Some interpretations have suggested severe cooling and ecological stress. Other evidence suggests that people or human groups continued in some regions after the ash fell. The ancient world was not one flat surface receiving one equal disaster. It was a mosaic of coasts, forests, grasslands, wetlands, river valleys, dry plains, and highlands. A cold shift that damaged one environment might leave another less affected. A dry interval that strained one group might be survivable for another near more reliable water. A region under ash might be abandoned for a time, while a distant region might experience only a quieter pressure. This unevenness matters because humanity did not live as one united population. It lived in small groups, scattered across different landscapes, each with its own risks and protections. For a human body, climate becomes real through daily consequences. It becomes the plant that does not return where it was expected. It becomes the animal herd that arrives later, or not at all. It becomes the stream that shrinks before the season is over. It becomes the child who needs food during a leaner month, the elder who cannot walk as far, and the injured adult whose recovery depends on the group having enough strength to spare. If Toba made parts of the world colder or drier, its effect on humans may not have appeared as instant destruction. It may have passed quietly through fewer successful births, more difficult movement, weaker connections between groups, and local endings that left almost no trace. Yet this must remain a question, not a conclusion. The title asks whether a volcano nearly killed every human on Earth and left only thousands alive. But the climate evidence alone cannot answer that. It opens a possibility, then forces us to compare it with archaeology, genetics, and environmental records. The frightening truth is not that we already know Toba almost ended humanity. The frightening truth is that the event was large enough, and humanity was small enough, for the question to be taken seriously. The word climate can sound too wide and distant, as if it belongs to charts rather than bodies. But for people living around the time of Toba, climate would have been felt through small changes that gathered weight. A slightly colder season could mean that edible plants returned later. A drier stretch could mean that animals moved away from the places where people expected them. A change in rainfall could turn a known route into a dangerous one, not because the land vanished, but because the reasons for walking that route disappeared. This is how a volcanic eruption, far from many human groups, could still become part of their lives. It did not need to arrive as fire. It could arrive as a harder morning, a longer search, a weaker child, or a group forced to decide whether to remain in a place that no longer answered their knowledge. When scientists discuss the possible climate effects of Toba, they are not only asking whether the planet became colder in a general sense, they are asking whether environmental pressure became strong enough, in enough places, to change the survival of small human populations. That is a much more difficult question. A global temperature estimate cannot tell us which stream dried first, which food plant failed, or which group found a safer coast. The ancient world had no single human experience. One community might have endured near a river that still held water. Another might have faced a landscape where familiar foods became scarce. A third might have moved, carrying children and tools into unknown ground. In this uneven world, climate stress would not have been shared equally. It would have selected through geography, season, distance, and chance. The same cooling that placed pressure on one region might have been softened in another. The same ashfall that damaged one habitat might have been thin enough elsewhere to become only one hardship among many. This unevenness is one reason the Toba debate remains open. If the eruption caused a severe and long volcanic winter everywhere, then the idea of a global human crisis becomes stronger. If the effects were shorter, more regional, or partly buffered by local refuges, then the story becomes less like a near-total ending and more like a dangerous disturbance that some groups survived. The evidence does not let us flatten the world into one answer. It asks us to imagine a patchwork of stress and survival. Some landscapes may have become poorer, some may have remained usable. Some groups may have lost contact with others. Some may have continued almost invisibly, leaving only faint traces in stone or sediment. For the origin of our species, this matters because Homo sapiens did not rise from a world of comfort. The human line moved through repeated environmental changes long before and long after Toba. But a very large eruption, placed inside a period when human populations were still relatively small and scattered, creates a special kind of risk. A large population can absorb loss in ways a small population cannot. In a small group, one failed season may mean fewer births. 2 failed seasons may mean movement into unknown land. A series of hard years may mean that an entire local line leaves no descendants. The climate does not need to kill everyone to change ancestry. It only needs to decide, quietly and unevenly, which groups are able to continue. This is why a darker climate is so central to the question in the title. The volcano itself was in Sumatra, but the survival question stretches across the human range. Did the eruption create a global pressure strong enough to narrow humanity, or did it become one powerful disturbance among many, serious in some places but not decisive everywhere? A truthful answer cannot be given too early. It has to remain open while we move from atmosphere to land, from land to food, from food to bodies, and from bodies to the long chain of descendants who eventually became us. A darker climate does not have to announce itself like a disaster. It can enter quietly, through the slow failure of things that once felt dependable. A plant that usually appeared after rain might return in smaller numbers. A waterhole might shrink earlier than memory expected. Animals might follow new paths, not because they vanished from the world, but because the world they followed had shifted. For early human groups, this kind of change could be deeply serious. Their survival depended on patterns. The land did not need to be easy, but it needed to be readable. People could endure hardship when they understood where to go, what to seek, and when a season usually turned. If Toba disturbed climate in wide enough regions, then one of its greatest dangers may have been the damage it did to predictability. A group can live with cold if it knows how cold arrives. It can live with dryness if it knows where water remains. But when old knowledge becomes less reliable, the body pays the cost first. Longer walking means more hunger. More hunger means less strength for children, pregnancy, healing, and movement. Less movement can mean fewer choices. Fewer choices can turn a difficult season into a narrowing path. This is why the climate question cannot be separated from the human population question. If people were numerous and widely connected, some groups could fail while others continued without much effect on the whole species. But if human populations were small, scattered, and unevenly connected, then environmental stress could shape the future more sharply. A local collapse might remove a lineage. A lost connection between groups might reduce exchange, mating, shared knowledge, or safe movement across regions. A surviving group might carry the story forward, while another group only a few valleys away left nothing that could be seen later. In this sense, the phrase "only thousands survived" is not only about how many people were alive after a disaster. It is about how narrow the bridge may have become between ancient people and everyone alive today. Still, the evidence requires restraint. Toba may have cooled parts of the world, and it may have placed pressure on ecosystems, but the exact strength and duration of that pressure remain debated. Some records and models point towards serious climate disturbance. Other archaeological signs suggest that human life continued in certain regions after the ash. These facts do not cancel each other. They may be showing the same ancient world from different angles. One place could be damaged while another endured. One population could decline while another remained stable enough to leave descendants. A severe event does not need to produce a single global result. Human survival may have been uneven, local, and difficult to measure from the fragments left behind. That is why this part of the story must stay open. If the climate after Toba was harsh, it would have tested the basic conditions of human life: food, water, warmth, movement, birth, care, and memory. If the climate shock was less severe or shorter than some early ideas suggested, then Toba may still have mattered, but not as the one cause that almost ended humanity. The truth may not be as simple as a world nearly emptied overnight. It may be quieter and more complex: a great eruption, a disturbed atmosphere, stressed landscapes, small groups adapting where they could, and unknown numbers of human lines that either continued or disappeared without leaving a clear sign. This is the careful doorway into the next question. The darkened sky matters because it gives the volcano a path into human biology. It turns geology into hunger, cold, distance, and uncertainty. But it does not yet prove how many survived. To understand whether humanity truly passed through a dangerous bottleneck, we must move from climate into population, from weather into ancestry, and from the ancient sky into the long, hidden pattern carried inside later human bloodlines. A population bottleneck is a strange idea because it does not look like the end of the world from the inside. It does not require every person to die in one terrible moment. It means that somewhere in the long chain between ancient people and people alive today, the number of ancestors who successfully carried the human line forward may have become very small. Many people could have lived and still left no descendants. Many groups could have existed and then disappeared from the future without anyone recording their absence. This is why the bottleneck question is so powerful in the Toba story. It shifts the focus away from a single scene of destruction and towards something quieter: the narrowing of ancestry. If the eruption created severe climate stress, and if human groups were already scattered and limited in number, then the danger may not have been only death. It may have been the loss of enough surviving lines that later humanity came through a thinner passage. Scientists use genetic evidence to think about this because DNA carries traces of population history. When a population remains large and diverse for a long time, it tends to preserve more variation. When a population becomes small, some variation can be lost by chance. Certain branches continue, others end. Later generations may carry only a reduced sample of what existed before. This does not give a simple head count from 75,000 years ago. It cannot tell us that a specific child lived, or that a specific group vanished beside a dry river. But it can suggest whether the ancestors of later humans passed through periods when the effective population size was much smaller than the total number of people who may have been alive. The phrase effective population is important. It does not mean the exact number of breathing humans on Earth. It means the number of people who contributed genetically to later generations in a way that shapes the patterns seen today. That difference matters greatly for the title. Only thousands survived can sound like a census, as if someone counted all humans after the eruption and found only a small remnant. No such count exists. A careful telling must say that some genetic models have supported the idea of a narrow ancestral population, while the cause, timing, and exact size remain debated. Toba is one possible event in that discussion, not a proven single answer. The human past was shaped by many pressures: climate shifts, migrations, isolation, food stress, and the uneven success of different groups. A bottleneck could come from one severe crisis, or from several pressures acting across time. This makes the Toba hypothesis both fascinating and difficult. The eruption happened when the human story was still fragile enough for a large environmental shock to matter. But connecting that shock directly to a global human bottleneck requires more than the size of the eruption. It requires evidence that populations actually narrowed in relation to that event. The danger of the bottleneck idea is that it can become too neat. It offers a dramatic shape. A volcano erupts, the world darkens, almost everyone dies, and a few thousand survivors become the ancestors of us all. That shape is powerful, but science rarely gives us such clean lines in deep prehistory. The real pattern may have been more uneven. Some populations may have declined. Some may have moved. Some may have survived in refuges. Some may have vanished without visible traces. The descendants who later spread across the world may represent only part of the diversity that once existed. That loss is hard to measure. So the bottleneck question does not answer the title yet. It sharpens it. It asks whether Toba was merely a vast eruption in the geological record, or whether it coincided with a narrowing in the ancestry of Homo sapiens so serious that the future of humanity passed through only a small opening. The reason a bottleneck is difficult to see is that it leaves its clearest marks long. After the people themselves are gone, a drought can leave a dry lake bed. A volcano can leave ash. A toolmaker can leave flakes of stone. But a narrowed population leaves something quieter, a change in the pattern of inheritance. Later humans may carry less variation than might be expected if their ancestors had remained large and widely connected. Some genetic lines become common because they pass through the narrow opening. Other lines disappear, not always because every person carrying them died at once, but because they did not continue into later generations. This is why the Toba question reaches into DNA. It asks whether the people who became the ancestors of later humanity were reduced to a smaller group during a dangerous period, and whether the eruption was part of that reduction. Yet this evidence must be handled with care. DNA is not a direct witness. It is a record shaped by many forces: survival, migration, isolation, chance, mating patterns, later expansions, and the loss of groups that left no descendants. When scientists estimate ancient population size, they are not opening a clear window onto 1 year after the eruption. They are building models from present and ancient genetic patterns, and models can change when assumptions change. That does not make them useless. It means they must be placed beside other evidence rather than treated as a single answer. The most important point is that population size in genetics does not always mean the number of living people on the ground. A landscape could hold many human beings, but only some might contribute to the future gene pool. A group could survive for generations and later vanish. Another group could remain small but become the source of many later descendants. In this way, the ancient human story may have been narrower in ancestry than it was in life. For the title, this is crucial. Only thousands survived may describe a possible ancestral narrowing more than a proven count of all living humans. It points toward a severe reduction in the line that led to us, not a census carved into stone. The eruption of Toba matters here because it offers a possible cause at a time when such a narrowing could have occurred. A darker climate, damaged ecosystems, longer searches for food, and broken connections between groups could all reduce the number of people who successfully left descendants. But the volcano does not stand alone. Human populations had already been shaped by older climate shifts and regional separations. Groups may have expanded, declined, mixed, or disappeared for reasons not tied to one eruption. A truthful account must therefore resist the comfort of one cause. Toba may have been a powerful pressure. It may have added stress to a fragile world. It may even have contributed to a narrowing in some populations. But the evidence does not let us say, with complete certainty, that the volcano alone almost erased the species. What we can say is more subtle, and perhaps more unsettling. The future of humanity may have depended not only on who survived the immediate disaster, but on which survivors remained connected, which children lived long enough to have children, which groups found enough food to continue, and which lines became part of the ancestry that later spread across the world. A bottleneck is not only a story of death. It is also a story of absence. It is the missing branches of the human tree, the people who may have lived real lives but left no trace inside living populations today. If Toba belongs to that story, then its deepest impact may not have been one visible catastrophe, but a narrowing of possibility. The eruption may have changed the sky. The climate may have changed the land may have changed the body. And, through the body, through hunger, birth, movement and survival, the ancient world may have changed the shape of the human future. The bottleneck question becomes most powerful when we stop imagining it as one sudden emptying of the world and begin to see it as a narrowing of continuation. A species can survive in the present and still lose much of its possible future. A group can remain alive for a time and still leave no descendants. A skill can be practiced for generations and then vanish when the people who carried it disappear or become absorbed into another line. This is why the idea of a human bottleneck is so closely tied to silence. It is not only the silence after death, it is the silence of branches that never reached us. Around the time of Toba, the human world was made of small communities, unevenly spread across landscapes, with deep roots in Africa and possible movements into other regions. If climate stress followed the eruption, then its effects would have entered that fragile structure through food, water, mobility, health, birth and connection. But a bottleneck would not require the same disaster everywhere. It could be produced by many local pressures adding up across generations. One group might endure near a coast, another might move inland and fail. Another might survive the first years after the eruption, but become too isolated to remain part of the larger human future. The result, seen much later through genetics, would not be a neat map of who lived and who died. It would be a reduced pattern of ancestry, a smaller surviving sample from a wider human past. This is the careful way to understand the phrase "only thousands survived." It may reflect a possible narrow ancestral population, not a confirmed headcount of every human being alive after Toba. The difference is important because the title is emotionally strong, while the science is incomplete. Some older interpretations connected the eruption with a dramatic reduction in human numbers. Later evidence has made the picture more complicated. Archaeological signs of continuity in some regions suggest that people did not simply disappear everywhere ash was found. Genetic studies can point to ancient narrowings, but tying one narrowing to one eruption is difficult. Climate models can show possible stress, but they cannot by themselves count children, families, or vanished groups. Each line of evidence opens the question from a different direction, and none should be forced to carry more certainty than it can hold. Yet the uncertainty does not make the story weak. It makes it more honest. The Toba eruption remains one of the rare events large enough to make us ask whether geology touched the ancestry of our species. The volcano may not have killed nearly every human in a simple, direct way, but it may still have contributed to a world where survival became narrower, where some groups continued and others faded, where the descendants who eventually became us passed through a smaller opening than we like to imagine. In deep time, survival is not measured only by the number of people breathing on one day. It is measured by whether life continues into the next generation, and the next, and the next. If too few children survive, a population narrows. If too few groups remain connected, variation is lost. If too many local lines end, the future carries only part of what once existed. That is the quiet meaning of a bottleneck. It is a reduction not only of numbers but of possibilities. When we look back from the modern world, with billions of humans spread across the planet, it is difficult to believe that our ancestry may once have been so thin. But the early human story was not guaranteed. It moved through climate, hunger, migration, isolation, and chance. Toba stands inside that story as a vast geological event that may have added pressure at a dangerous time. Whether it was the main cause or one force among many, It reminds us that the human future was once carried by small groups under uncertain skies, and that everyone alive now may descend from survivors whose world was far less secure than ours appears to be. The phrase "only thousands survived" is powerful because it gives the mind something sharp to hold. Millions are difficult to imagine. Extinction is too large and final. But thousands feels close enough to become personal. It turns the whole human species into something like a few scattered gatherings around water, fire, and shelter. It makes the modern world feel impossible, as if every city, language, memory, and family line had once been compressed into a dangerously small human remnant. But this number is also dangerous because it can sound more certain than the evidence allows. No one counted the humans who lived after Toba. No ancient record tells us how many remained. The number comes from scientific attempts to understand population history, especially through genetics, and those attempts do not all point to one exact answer. When researchers speak about small ancestral populations, they're often speaking about effective population size, not the total number of people alive. That difference is not small. It changes the meaning of the entire claim. There may have been more living humans than the genetic signal suggests, because not everyone who lived became an ancestor of later people. Some groups may have survived for a while and then vanished. Some may have left tools but no descendants. Others may have remained small yet became central to the future human line. So when we hear that only thousands survived, we should not picture a clean global census after the eruption. We should picture a harder and more uncertain question. How narrow did the line of ancestry become, and how much of humanity's earlier diversity failed to pass through that narrow opening? This is why the number must be handled gently. It is not useless. It points toward a real scientific concern that Homo sapiens may have passed through a period when the surviving ancestral population was much smaller than the later success of the species suggests. But it is not a stone tablet with a final answer carved into it. The early human world was scattered across regions, and those regions did not all share the same fate. A group in one place might have been nearly erased by hunger, dryness, or isolation. Another group, living near better water or more reliable coastal resources, might have continued with less visible disruption. A third group might have moved, mixed with others, or disappeared from the record altogether. Later DNA can show patterns left by survival and loss, but it cannot restore every vanished community. It cannot tell us whether a small child near an ancient river survived one hungry year. It cannot tell us which group remembered a path that saved them, or which group followed a path that failed. This is where the human origin story becomes quiet and unsettling. The ancestors of everyone alive today may not represent all the humans who existed before and around Toba. They may represent the lines that happened to continue. If so, then the number of survivors that mattered for later ancestry could have been much smaller than the number of people who once breathed, walked, suffered, and hoped under that ancient sky. The title asks whether a volcano nearly killed every human on Earth. The careful answer cannot begin with certainty. It must begin with scale, pressure, and inheritance. Toba was large enough to disturb the world. Human populations were small enough for disturbance to matter. Genetics gives reasons to ask whether our ancestry narrowed. Archaeology gives reasons to avoid saying that all human life collapsed everywhere. Between these facts lies the dangerous number. It may not tell us exactly how many survived, but it does force us to imagine something modern life makes easy to forget. That humanity may once have depended on a far smaller living bridge than the vastness of our species today would ever suggest. A small surviving number becomes frightening because it changes the meaning of chance. In a large population, one death is a sorrow, but the larger pattern continues. One failed birth does not alter the whole future. One isolated group can vanish while many others remain connected, but in a very small population, chance becomes heavier. A few lean seasons can shape ancestry. A sickness moving through one camp can remove more than lives. It can remove future lines. A dangerous migration can separate people who might otherwise have exchanged partners, knowledge, and help. This is why the idea of only thousands surviving cannot be treated only as a dramatic image. It points to the mathematics of vulnerability. When numbers are low, ordinary hardship becomes sharper. The same hunger that a larger population might absorb can become decisive for a smaller one. The same distance between groups can become a barrier. The same cold season can change who has children, who recovers, and who leaves descendants. If Toba added climate stress to an already scattered human world, then its danger may have worked through this narrowness. It may not have needed to erase every group. It may only have needed to push enough groups below the level where they could continue. But the word survived also needs care. Survival has layers. A person can survive the first year after a disaster and die before raising children. A group can survive for generations and later disappear from the ancestry of living people. A population can remain present in the archaeological record while contributing little or nothing to later genetic lines. This is why the number thousands is difficult. It may refer to the effective ancestral population that shaped later humans, not the full count of every person alive on Earth. The difference is quiet, but enormous. Imagine a broad landscape after the eruption, with some communities enduring, some moving, some shrinking, and some becoming cut off. From inside that world, there would be no single moment when humanity knew whether it had survived. There would be only days of finding food, carrying children, guarding fire, waiting for seasons, and following memory through altered land. But thousands of years later, the descendants might carry a narrower genetic pattern, as if only part of the earlier human world had passed forward. The lost part would not necessarily be visible. It would be made of people who existed, struggled, and perhaps survived for a time, but did not become ancestors of the later human majority. This is the deeper discomfort inside the title. It is not only asking how many bodies remained after a volcano, it is asking how many futures remained. If the surviving ancestral bridge was very small, then every later human story rests on a fragile passage that could have failed. Yet a careful account must keep the uncertainty alive. Some archaeological evidence argues against a simple global collapse. Some regions show signs of continued human activity around the time of the Toba ash. This does not mean the eruption was harmless. It means the world was uneven. It means survival may have been regional, complex, and difficult to reduce to one number. A few thousand effective ancestors, if that is close to the truth in some models, would not mean that only a few thousand people physically existed everywhere after the eruption. It would mean that the line leading to later humans became narrow in a way that later DNA can still hint at. The danger is in confusing a genetic signal with a head count. The value is in realizing that both point toward the same serious question: how close did the human future come to becoming too small? Around 75,000 years ago, there were no written names, no borders, no nations, and no records of birth or death. There were only living groups whose continuity depended on food, water, health, movement, care, and enough connection to keep population lines alive. If Toba darkened skies or disturbed climate, then its pressure would have entered that delicate system quietly. Some groups may have found refuge, some may have faded. Some may have left descendants who carried humanity forward without knowing they were carrying anything more than their own children through a difficult world. The dangerous number remains dangerous because it sits between science and imagination. It is strong enough to make the ancient world feel close, but uncertain enough that we must not treat it as a finished answer. Only thousands survived can help a listener understand the scale of possible vulnerability, yet it can also mislead if it sounds like a proven count. The truth is more careful. Human ancestry may have narrowed. Some genetic evidence has supported the idea that the population contributing to later humans was once very small, but the exact number, the exact timing, and the exact cause are still difficult to close. Toba stands as one powerful candidate for pressure because its eruption was real, vast, and placed near a period when Homo sapiens was still a scattered species. But the volcano cannot be made to carry more certainty than the evidence gives it. The safest way to hold the story is to see the number as a doorway, not a verdict. It opens the question of how small the surviving ancestral bridge may have become. It does not settle the question by itself. If the bridge truly narrowed to a few thousand effective ancestors, then the meaning is profound. It would mean that the later human world, with all its languages, migrations, tools, rituals, farms, cities, and memories, passed through a very limited human channel. It would mean that many possible human futures did not continue, not because every person outside that channel died at once, and not because one eruption can be blamed for every loss, but because deep history often preserves only the lines that happen to remain unbroken. A community could have survived the first cold seasons after Toba and still ended later. A group could have carried useful knowledge across a difficult landscape and still left no descendants known to us. A population could have existed at the edge of the human range, endured for a time, then disappeared into silence. Those people would still have been real, but the future would not remember them through living bloodlines. This is the quiet tragedy inside any bottleneck. It is not only a reduction of people, it is a reduction of paths. It makes ancestry look like a narrow trail crossing a wide field of absence. The Toba eruption may have contributed to that absence, or it may have been one stress among several in a longer age of climate instability, movement, isolation, and local survival. The evidence does not let us turn the title into a final claim, but it does let us understand why the title asks a serious question. A volcano of extraordinary scale erupted. Ash travelled across enormous distances. Climate may have been disturbed. Human populations were small and unevenly spread. Some genetic patterns suggest that our ancestry passed through narrow phases. Archaeological evidence, however, also shows that human life did not simply vanish everywhere the ash appears. The result is not a simple yes or no. It is a tension between survival and loss. It asks us to imagine a human world where some groups continued, some may have moved, some may have declined, and some may have vanished without leaving enough evidence for certainty. By the end of this question, the number becomes less like a headline and more like a warning. It warns us not to confuse modern abundance with ancient security. Today, humanity appears immense. Around 75,000 years ago, the future may have rested on scattered groups who had no way to know what they represented. They were not trying to save a species. They were trying to live through weather, hunger, distance, birth, and care. If Toba darkened part of their world, then survival would have depended on the smallest things: water that remained clean, food that could still be found, children who endured, elders who remembered, and groups that stayed connected enough for life to continue. Whether the number was truly only thousands, or whether the real picture was wider and more complex, the deeper truth remains the same. The human future was once far less certain than the present makes it seem. To understand survival after Toba, the story has to return to Africa, not as a simple shelter where nothing changed, but as the deep center of the human beginning. The oldest roots of Homo sapiens lie in Africa, across a vast and varied continent of deserts, grasslands, woodlands, wetlands, coasts, mountains, and river systems. This matters because no single environment can explain early human survival. Africa was not one refuge. It was many possible refuges, separated by distance, climate, terrain, and season. If the eruption under Sumatra disturbed the wider climate, then the question becomes whether some African landscapes remained stable enough for human groups to continue. A refuge does not have to be comfortable. It only has to be survivable. It may be a coast where shellfish and other resources remained available, a river valley where water still returned, a wetland edge where plants and animals gathered, or a region where climate stress was less severe than elsewhere. In deep history, survival often depends on such uneven places. When one landscape becomes too dry, another may still hold water. When open plains become harsher, a wooded edge may provide more options. When animals move away from one area, people who know another route may continue. This is why Africa becomes central to the Toba question. If humanity passed through a dangerous narrowing, some of the lines that survived likely did so in landscapes that buffered the worst pressures. Yet we should not imagine those places as safe havens in the modern sense. There were no walls, no stored grain, no planned rescue, and no knowledge of a global crisis. There were only local decisions made under local conditions. People moved because water, food, kinship, danger, and memory pushed or pulled them. A group near a reliable source might remain. Another might follow animals or seasonal plants. Another might split, with some individuals moving and others staying. Each decision could matter, without anyone knowing it mattered to the future of the species. Africa's importance also comes from time. Homo sapiens did not appear suddenly just before Toba. The species had a deeper history, with populations shaped by earlier environmental changes, regional separations, and movements across the continent. By the time of the eruption, human groups were already part of a long African story. If Toba created stress, it entered a world that had already taught humans to live with variation. That does not mean they were invulnerable. It means their survival depended on flexibility that had been tested before, using different foods, moving across changing environments, cooperating within groups, caring for children, and preserving knowledge through living memory. These strengths may have helped some groups endure, but they did not guarantee survival for all. In a small population, even strong adaptation can fail if water disappears, if illness spreads, if births decline, or if isolation becomes too severe. The idea of Africa as a deep refuge is therefore not a simple answer to the title. It does not prove that Toba was harmless. It suggests a more careful possibility. While some regions may have suffered deeply, other regions may have allowed enough people to continue for the human line to remain unbroken. The future may not have been saved by one place, one group, or one sudden recovery. It may have been preserved by scattered endurance across multiple landscapes. Some of those groups may have become ancestors of later humans, others may have vanished from the record. What survived was not the whole ancient world, but enough continuity for the next generations to exist. This is the quiet power of the African refuge idea. It reminds us that survival is often local before it becomes global. The species did not need every landscape to remain kind. It needed enough places where children could live, where food could still be found, where groups could remain connected or reconnect, and where memory could carry people through a darker time. Africa matters in this story because it was not only a place on a map, it was a wide field of different human possibilities. Across deep time, groups of Homo sapiens lived in regions that did not all respond to climate in the same way. A dry period could press hard on one landscape while another still held water. A cooler interval could change plant growth in one region while a coast, wetland, or river system still offered enough resources for people to continue. This unevenness may have been one of the great protections of early humanity. A species spread thinly across different environments is vulnerable, but it is also not exposed to one single failure. If one region becomes too harsh, another may remain open. If one group disappears, another may carry part of the human line forward. This does not make the story comforting. It means survival may have depended on a patchwork of places, some enduring, some failing, and some changing too quickly for people to remain. A refuge, in this ancient sense, was not a peaceful sanctuary. It was simply a place where the basic chain of life did not break. Food had to be available often enough. Water had to be reachable often enough. Children had to survive often enough. People had to remain connected enough for families and groups to continue across generations. If Toba darkened skies or altered climate, then African refuges would not have saved humanity by being untouched. They may have saved humanity by being less damaged, more varied, or more forgiving than other places. A coastline might provide resources when inland foods declined. A river valley might gather animals when surrounding land dried. A mosaic of woodland, grassland, and water might give people more than one way to live. For small human groups, this variety could be the difference between movement and disappearance. It could allow a group to shift diet, change route, remain near water, or join with others. But none of this should be described as planned survival. Early people did not know they were preserving a species. They were responding to immediate pressures with knowledge inherited from those before them. Their decisions were local. The consequences became global only because later generations descended from the people who happened to continue. This is why the deep African refuge is important to the question of only thousands survived. If the surviving ancestral population became very small, it may not have been gathered in one dramatic place. It may have been distributed across several workable landscapes, connected sometimes, separated at other times, shaped by climate, distance, and chance. Some groups may have remained near familiar water. Some may have moved toward richer edges. Some may have mixed after separation. Others may have faded from the future. Later genetic patterns would not preserve the full complexity of these lives. They would preserve only the lines that passed through. Archaeology, too, can show signs of human presence, tools, or occupation, but it rarely gives a complete map of who survived and who did not. This makes Africa both central and mysterious. It holds the deeper roots of our species, yet it does not give a simple answer to Toba. It tells us that the human line had places where it could endure, but not that every line endured. It suggests that survival may have been more resilient than a total collapse story allows, but also more fragile than modern abundance makes us feel. The great lesson is one of scale. The volcano erupted far away in Sumatra, but the future of Homo sapiens may have depended on landscapes across Africa where the pressure of climate was felt in quieter ways. If enough groups found enough food, if enough children lived, if enough knowledge remained inside living communities, then the human story could continue. Not as a triumph written in stone, but as a thin thread carried from one uncertain season to the next. The idea of Africa as a deep refuge should not be understood as a simple rescue scene. There was no single protected valley where all later humanity waited for the world to recover. There was no clear border between danger and safety. The more careful picture is quieter. Many landscapes, many small groups, many degrees of stress, and many different outcomes. Some places may have remained usable when others became harder. Some groups may have found enough food and water to continue. Some may have moved away from familiar ground and entered new risks. Some may have survived for a time, then disappeared from the later human line. This is why the refuge idea matters. It does not close the Toba question. It gives the question a place to breathe. If the eruption changed climate beyond Sumatra, then survival would have depended on where people were, what resources remained, and whether local knowledge still matched the altered land. Africa's size and ecological variety may have offered more than one path through difficulty. A coast could provide food when inland plants became less reliable. A river system could remain important when surrounding land dried. A wetland, woodland edge, or seasonal corridor could gather animals and plants in ways that supported small groups. But these were not permanent guarantees. A place that helped one generation might fail another. A group that survived one harsh interval might still lose connection with others. The origin of modern humanity was not protected by certainty. It was carried through changing environments by living people whose choices were limited by the body. They could walk, but not endlessly. They could remember, but memory could not control rainfall. They could cooperate, but cooperation still needed something to share. In this way, Africa becomes the deep human background against which the Toba eruption must be measured. If the volcano did contribute to a severe narrowing, then some surviving lines likely passed through African landscapes that were difficult but not impossible. If the impact was less severe than the strongest version of the theory suggests, Africa still remains central because it held much of the deeper population structure from which later humans emerged. Either way, the continent is not simply a stage. It is part of the answer. It reminds us that the human future was shaped not only by catastrophe, but by uneven survival across different environments. This also helps explain why archaeology and genetics do not always give the same emotional story. A tool found after the ash may show that people continued in a region. A genetic narrowing may suggest that only part of the wider human world became ancestral to later populations. Both can be true. Some people can continue locally while other lines vanish. Some regions can preserve evidence while others leave almost nothing. Some groups can live through the aftermath of a crisis without becoming the main source of later descendants. The past is not required to make one clean pattern for us. It was lived in fragments. The African refuge question therefore leads us back to the title, with more caution and more depth. Did one volcano nearly kill every human on Earth? Perhaps the strongest version of that claim is too simple. But did the eruption occur at a time when humanity was small, scattered, and vulnerable enough that a major environmental shock could matter profoundly? That question remains serious. The survival of Homo sapiens may have depended on a network of small continuities: enough water, enough food, enough births, enough memory, enough movement, enough connection between groups. Africa may have held many of those continuities, not as a perfect shelter, but as a broad and varied homeland where some human lines remained alive. If later humanity came through a narrow gate, then that gate was not only made of disaster. It was also made of refuges, endurance, and the quiet ability of small groups to continue when the wider world became uncertain. Survival after Toba should not be imagined as one small group hiding in one perfect place while the rest of the world failed. That kind of image is easy to understand, but it is probably too simple for deep human history. Early humans did not live as one gathered population. They lived in scattered communities across different landscapes with different risks and different protections. Some groups may have been close to rivers. Some may have lived near coasts. Some may have moved through open grassland, woodland edges, wetlands, or dry regions where water was seasonal and uncertain. If the eruption changed climate, then it would not have placed the same burden everywhere. One region might have become colder, drier, or less predictable. Another might have remained difficult but survivable. A third might have been damaged for a time, then slowly become usable again. This is why survival was probably not one place. It was a pattern of uneven endurance. A volcano could begin in Sumatra, but its human consequences would spread through geography in complicated ways. Ash might fall thickly in some regions and thinly in others. Climate effects might reach far beyond the ash itself. Plant communities might shift, animals might move, water sources might become less reliable, but each local world would respond in its own way. For people living through those changes, the question was never global. They were not asking whether Homo sapiens would survive as a species. They were asking, in the language of daily life, whether there was food nearby, whether children could be carried or fed, whether a familiar path still led to water, whether another group could be reached, whether the season could be endured. The future of humanity may have depended on many such local answers. Some answers may have been yes. Others may have been no. The danger of telling the Toba story too simply is that it turns survival into a single dramatic outcome. But the ancient world was made of fragments. A group could survive near a coast because marine foods remained available when inland foods became unreliable. Another could continue near a river that still gathered animals and plants. Another could move toward a wetland, a lake, or a wooded edge where resources were more varied. Yet another could become trapped in a landscape where old knowledge no longer worked. These differences matter because small populations are shaped by place. A refuge is not only a location, it is a relationship between bodies and the environment. It must give enough water, enough food, enough shelter, and enough chance for births to continue. It must allow people to move without exhausting themselves completely. It must preserve enough memory to make the land readable. If those conditions held in several places, then humanity did not need one central shelter. It needed enough scattered continuities to keep the line from breaking. This view also helps explain why the evidence can seem divided. Archaeology may show that people continued in some areas after Toba ash. Genetics may suggest that later ancestry passed through narrow phases. Climate evidence may point to serious disturbance, while local records may show survival. These are not always contradictions. They may be signs of a world where some human lines endured and others faded. A severe event can be real without producing equal collapse everywhere. A population can narrow without every region becoming empty. A group can leave tools above an ash layer and still belong to a fragile, reduced world. The title asks whether a volcano nearly killed every human on Earth and left only thousands behind. To approach that question honestly, we have to replace the image of one last remnant with a slower image. Many small groups, separated by land and distance, living through different degrees of pressure. Some may have become ancestors of later humanity. Some may have vanished from the future. Some may have survived the first shock but not the generations after it. The human story may have continued not because the world remained safe, but because enough places remained just survivable enough, for just long enough, for the next generation to breathe. A scattered survival pattern changes the way we understand danger. If all humans had lived in one place, then one disaster could have ended the story more easily. But if people were spread across many regions, the same disaster would become uneven. Distance could protect some groups. Local water could protect others. A coast, a wetland, a river mouth, or a seasonally rich valley could soften stress even while another landscape became harder to live in. This does not mean early humans were safe. It means their risk was distributed. Some groups may have faced severe hunger, movement, or isolation, while others may have continued with less visible disruption. In deep history, survival is often not a single victory. It is a series of partial continuities. One group keeps enough children alive, another remembers a route through dry land, another finds food at the edge of water, another disappears, without leaving a clear trace. If Toba placed pressure on the world, it likely entered this patchwork rather than one unified human population. This is why the idea of only thousands survived must be held beside the idea of multiple refuges. A small ancestral population does not necessarily mean one final camp of people. It may mean that among many groups, only some lines continued into the future. Others may have lived through the first aftermath but failed later. Some may have become separated from larger networks. Some may have mixed with other groups and left only faint signals. Some may have left tools, charcoal, or scattered stone flakes, but no descendants known to us. The past can preserve activity without preserving ancestry. It can preserve ancestry without preserving a clear place. That is why Toba remains difficult. The event is large enough to invite a dramatic story, but the human evidence asks for a quieter one. Imagine the world after the eruption not as a single dark map, but as many local worlds reacting differently. In one region, ash may have changed soil and water. In another, the main problem may have been cooler weather. In another, rainfall may have shifted. Farther away, people may have noticed only that certain foods became less predictable. A group that had many resource options might endure. A group depending on a narrow seasonal pattern might suffer. A group near water might stay. A group on the edge of a dry zone might move or vanish. These differences could decide which human lines remained open. The origin of later humanity may therefore have depended on ecological variety as much as endurance. Survival was not only strength inside the body, it was also the luck of where a body stood when the world changed. It was the presence of edible plants, animals, shellfish, fresh water, shelter, and other people within reachable distance. It was the ability to change a route before weakness became fatal. It was the chance that one group, under pressure, could still meet another and keep the human web from breaking completely. This is a more honest way to approach the title. A volcano may have nearly narrowed humanity not by striking everyone equally, but by testing the weak links between scattered groups. If those links broke too widely, the future would become smaller. If enough links held, the species could continue even after terrible losses. The evidence from archaeology, genetics, and climate does not give us a perfect map of this process. It gives fragments. Some fragments point to stress, some point to continuity, some point to population narrowing. Some warn us that the strongest extinction version may be too simple. Together, they suggest a human world that was neither untouched nor completely erased. It was a world where survival may have been spread across many small thresholds. Enough water, enough food, enough children, enough movement, enough memory, enough connection. If those thresholds held in more than one place, then humanity did not need a single refuge to survive Toba. It needed a scattered pattern of endurance, fragile in each place, but powerful when carried across generations. The idea of scattered survival brings the Toba story closer to the way life actually continues. Life does not usually survive because the whole world remains kind. It survives because, somewhere, enough conditions remain possible. A small group finds water where another does not. A coastline still gives food when inland plants fail. A river valley holds animals for a little longer. A patch of woodland protects people from wind. A remembered path leads to a place that has not yet become empty. None of these things looks large when seen alone, but across generations they can become the difference between a broken human line and a living one. If Toba placed pressure on early humans, then the survival of Homo sapiens may have depended on many such small continuities rather than one dramatic refuge. This makes the story less simple, but more true to the ancient world. People were spread across landscapes that did not all suffer in the same way. Some places may have been damaged by ash, some may have felt climate stress more than ash itself. Some may have remained difficult but usable, some may have been abandoned and later entered again. A group's future depended not only on the size of the eruption, but on the local shape of survival around them. Was there water close enough? Were there animals still moving through the area? Could children be fed while adults searched farther? Were other groups within reach? Did older knowledge still match the changed land? These questions were not written down, but they shaped ancestry. This is why a scattered survival model helps us understand both sides of the debate. It allows the eruption to be serious without making every region collapse. It allows human continuity in some archaeological records without pretending that every human line remained safe. It allows a population bottleneck without requiring one final group alone in the world. The past can be severe and uneven at the same time. That is often how real history works, especially before states, roads, farms, and stored food. The human species may have survived not as a single strong body, but as many vulnerable bodies distributed across many different risks. Some groups may have endured because they were in better places, some because they could move, some because they had wider food choices, some because they remained connected. Others may have failed for reasons that left no clear mark. A lost group does not always leave a grave. A lost lineage does not always leave a visible break in stone tools. Sometimes the only sign of loss is the narrowness of what came after. Around 75,000 years ago, if the world became darker or more difficult after Toba, the future of humanity would have been carried by people who did not know they were part of a species-level crisis. They were not saving humanity as an idea. They were keeping a child warm, carrying food, watching clouds, remembering a path, sharing what could be shared, and deciding whether to stay or move. The global meaning of those acts became visible only much later, because later humans existed to look back. This is the quiet center of scattered survival. It is not heroic in the usual sense. It is not one last stand. It is endurance spread thinly across geography and time. The title asks whether a volcano nearly killed every human on Earth and left only thousands behind. After looking at refuges, the better question becomes more delicate. Did enough small worlds remain open for enough human lines to continue? The answer may never be exact. But the shape of the question matters. It shows that human survival may have depended on neither complete safety nor complete collapse. It may have depended on a patchwork of difficult places where life remained barely possible and where the next generation could still begin. The evidence that complicates the Toba story begins with a simple problem. The Earth keeps some records very well, and others very poorly. Ash can survive, stone tools can survive, sediments can preserve chemical traces, but hunger does not fossilize easily. Movement rarely leaves a clear line. A group that disappears may leave nothing obvious behind. A group that survives may leave only a few pieces of work stone, scattered in soil, without names, faces, or voices. This is why the question in the title cannot be answered by one kind of evidence alone. If we look only at the volcano, the story becomes too large and too dramatic. If we look only at one site where human activity continued, the story may become too calm. The difficult truth is that both pressure and continuity can exist in the same ancient world. In some places, archaeological evidence suggests that people or human groups continued to use landscapes around the time of the Toba ash. This matters because it challenges the simplest version of the catastrophe story. If a region shows signs of human presence before the ash and signs again after the ash, then the idea that the eruption erased all nearby human life becomes harder to defend. Yet even this evidence must be read carefully. Continuity in tools does not always prove that the exact same group remained in place without interruption. People may have left and returned. Different groups may have used similar methods. A landscape may have been abandoned briefly, then used again when conditions improved. Archaeology gives traces of activity, not a complete biography of populations. Still, these traces are important because they stop the story from becoming a clean myth of near-total destruction. They remind us that early humans were resilient, mobile, and capable of living through difficult change in at least some regions. The complication becomes even deeper when archaeology is placed beside genetics. Genetic patterns may suggest narrow ancestry, but archaeological continuity may suggest that human activity did not collapse everywhere. These two ideas can feel contradictory, but they do not have to be. A population can continue locally while contributing little to later ancestry. A group can survive an eruption and still disappear thousands of years later. A tool tradition can persist while the people making it change through movement, mixing, or replacement. A genetic bottleneck can occur without every landscape becoming empty. This is why the Toba question remains open rather than solved. The evidence does not point to one simple sentence. It points to a world where survival, loss, movement, and uncertainty overlapped. The title says, "A volcano nearly killed every human on Earth, leaving only thousands behind." The evidence asks us to slow that sentence down. What does nearly mean in deep time? Does it mean a sudden drop after one event? Does it mean a long period of pressure, where only some lines continued? Does it mean a narrow effective ancestral population, not the total number of living people? And how do we connect a layer of ash in the ground with the invisible structure of human descent? These questions matter, because the ancient world was not arranged for easy interpretation. It was lived locally and preserved unevenly. A stone tool above ash may say that someone returned. It does not say how many others never did. A genetic signal may say that later ancestry narrowed. It does not say that one volcano caused every loss. A climate model may suggest cooling. It does not show every valley, child, stream, or decision. The evidence that complicates the story is therefore not a weakness. It is what keeps the story truthful. It prevents us from turning Toba into either a simple apocalypse or a harmless event. It asks us to imagine a severe eruption entering a human world that was scattered, adaptive, vulnerable, and unevenly preserved. Some groups may have endured, some may have suffered, some may have vanished without leaving enough evidence for certainty. And between those possibilities lies the deeper mystery of whether the human future was truly narrowed by the ash, or whether the ash only marks one great pressure among many that shaped the fragile road out of our ancient beginning. One of the strongest complications in the Toba story comes from places where the human record does not disappear as neatly as an older catastrophe story might expect. In some regions touched by Toba ash, researchers have found signs that stone tool use continued across the time of the eruption. This does not make the event small. It does not mean the climate was unchanged. It does not mean every group was safe. But it does mean that the simplest image of a world emptied by ash is not enough. The ground itself seems to answer with a more difficult message. People were still present, or they returned, or similar ways of making tools continued after the volcanic layer was laid down. Any one of these possibilities makes the human story less like total collapse and more like uneven endurance. A layer of ash can divide time into before and after, but human life may have crossed that line in more than one way. A group may have stayed nearby through a difficult period. Another may have left and later come back when water and plants recovered. A different group may have entered the landscape after the worst damage had passed. The tools alone cannot always tell us which of these happened. Stone preserves action but not identity. A flake of stone can show that someone struck a core with skill. It cannot tell us whether that person was the child of people who lived there before the ash, or a newcomer whose group arrived later. This is why archaeology both helps and unsettles the Toba question. It gives real evidence against the most extreme version of disappearance, but it also refuses to make survival simple. Continuity in material culture is not the same as comfort, abundance, or unbroken ancestry. People can keep making tools while their numbers decline. They can continue using a place while life becomes harder. They can survive locally while the larger population structure still narrows. This is important because the title speaks in global terms, while the evidence often speaks in local fragments. A site with tools above the ash does not prove that all humanity was secure. A region with no clear tools after the ash does not prove that everyone there died. The ancient record is uneven. An absence can mean many things: erosion, poor preservation, movement to another place, a temporary gap, or a real loss of population. To read the evidence honestly, we have to allow for both presence and silence. The same eruption could leave visible continuity in one landscape and deep disruption in another. The same human species could show resilience in one region and vulnerability in the wider genetic pattern. This is why the Toba debate has lasted. It stands at the meeting point of evidence that does not all speak with one voice. The ash tells us the eruption reached far. Archaeology tells us that human activity did not simply vanish everywhere. Genetics asks whether later ancestry became narrow. Climate studies ask how much the atmosphere and ecosystems changed. None of these can replace the others. Together, they make the story slower, more careful, and more human. They show that early humans were not passive figures waiting under a dark sky. They were living beings who moved, adjusted, remembered, and used landscapes in ways that may not always be visible. At the same time, resilience should not be exaggerated into safety. A group can endure one crisis and still lose people, knowledge, and connections. A population can remain present but reduced. A tool tradition can continue through a thinner human world. The most truthful picture may be one in which Toba did not erase humanity, but did enter a fragile ancient world and test it unevenly. Some human lines may have crossed the ash boundary. Others may have ended beyond our ability to trace them. The question is not only whether people survived somewhere. Clearly, the human story continued. The deeper question is how much was lost, how narrow the surviving ancestry became, and whether the ash of Sumatra marks a moment when the future of Homo sapiens passed through a difficult gate without leaving us a complete record of the cost. The evidence that complicates the Toba story does not weaken the mystery, it deepens it. A simple disaster story would be easier to tell. The volcano erupted, the sky darkened, humanity nearly vanished, and a few survivors carried everything forward. But the ancient record does not allow that kind of clean certainty. It gives us ash that proves an enormous eruption. It gives us climate questions that suggest possible stress. It gives us genetic patterns that raise the possibility of narrow ancestry. It gives us archaeological traces that show people did not simply disappear everywhere the ash fell. These pieces do not fit together like a finished map. They fit together like fragments from a world that was lived locally, broken by time, and preserved unevenly. This is why the story must remain careful. The Toba eruption was real, and its scale was extraordinary. But the human meaning of that eruption is harder to close, because people can survive in one kind of record and vanish in another. A group can leave stone tools after the ash, showing that human activity continued in a region, yet that same group may not have become part of the main ancestry of later humans. A population can leave descendants, but little visible archaeology. Another can leave archaeology, but no living genetic line that we can clearly identify. Climate can place pressure on a landscape without making every site empty. Ash can mark a moment without explaining every human choice around it. The past is not obligated to answer in one voice. It often answers in layers, and those layers can disagree until we learn how to read them together. This matters deeply for the title, because the phrase "nearly killed every human on Earth" sounds like a single event with a single result. The evidence suggests something more difficult, a severe natural event entering a scattered human world where the outcome may have varied from place to place. Some groups may have crossed the ash boundary with enough continuity to be visible later. Some may have moved away from damaged ground and returned. Some may have survived but declined. Some may have disappeared so completely that neither stone nor DNA clearly preserves them. In deep human history, loss is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply the absence of a line that might have continued. Sometimes it is a missing connection between groups. Sometimes it is a skill no longer passed on, a route no longer walked, a child who never becomes an ancestor. The complication, then, is not whether Toba mattered or did not matter. The better question is how it mattered. Did it create a short but severe shock? Did it worsen pressures already present in the climate? Did it affect some regions much more strongly than others? Did it contribute to a narrowing of ancestry without causing a total global collapse? These questions are more honest than a simple yes or no. They also keep the human story closer to the ground. Early people were not living inside scientific categories. They were living through water, weather, food, illness, care, movement, and memory. If the eruption changed their world, it did so through those ordinary channels. If they survived through them as well. By the end of this difficult evidence, one thing becomes clear. The Toba story cannot be used as a cheap shock. It is more valuable than that. It shows how a real geological disaster can become a serious question about human origins, but only if we respect the limits of what the evidence can prove. The eruption may have narrowed the human road. It may have tested scattered groups in ways we can only partly see. It may have left some regions wounded and others still livable. What remains is not a closed verdict, but a carefully held uncertainty. Somewhere between ash, stone, climate, and ancestry, the human future passed forward. carrying both survival and loss inside it. What humanity could have lost after Toba is larger than the number of people who may have died. Death is the most visible form of loss, but in deep history there are quieter losses that can shape the future just as strongly. A group can disappear, and with it a way of knowing a river, a season, a shelter, a stone source, or a path through difficult land. A family line can end, and with it a piece of genetic variation that will never return. A child can fail to survive, and with that child an entire branch of possible descendants disappears before it begins. This is why a population crisis is not only a crisis of bodies, it is a crisis of possibilities. If Toba placed pressure on early humans, whether through ash, climate, food stress, or broken movement, then the loss may have reached beyond the people immediately harmed. It may have reduced the variety of futures available to Homo sapiens. Before writing, farming, cities, or stored archives, human knowledge lived only in people. It was not separate from the body. A route was remembered because someone had walked it. A plant was known because someone had learned when and where it returned. A method of shaping stone survived because hands repeated it, and younger eyes watched. A fire-making habit continued because one generation passed the practice to another. If a group vanished, this kind of knowledge could vanish with it. Some of it might exist elsewhere, in other groups, but not always in the same form. Local knowledge is local because it belongs to a particular landscape. The loss of one group could mean the loss of a relationship with one part of the world. This matters for the title because only thousands survived is not simply a question of how many people remained alive. It is a question of how much earlier human diversity passed through the narrow gate into later history. Even if more than thousands of people lived after the eruption, the number of lines that became ancestral to later humans may have been much smaller than the number of lives that once existed. That means modern humanity may carry only part of the older human range. We may descend from the continuities that survived, while many other continuities ended without a clear trace. The loss could have been biological but also cultural in the broadest sense. Ways of moving, ways of using resources, patterns of cooperation, memories of landscapes, and small adaptations to local environments. We should not romanticize this or invent details that cannot be known. We cannot say exactly what any lost group knew, thought, or felt, but we can understand the principle. In a world where information was carried by living people, the disappearance of people meant the disappearance of information. The Toba question becomes more haunting when seen this way. The eruption did not need to erase all humans to change the future. It only needed to contribute to enough local endings, enough isolation, or enough reduced reproduction to make the later human story narrower than the earlier one had been. A severe climate disturbance could remove groups from marginal lands. A damaged food web could force movement into places already occupied by others. A long period of scarcity could reduce births. A broken connection between groups could reduce exchange and make survival harder. Each of these pressures would leave a different kind of silence. Some silences might appear in DNA as lost variation. Some might appear in archaeology as a gap. Some might leave no sign at all. This is the deepest kind of ancient loss. Not only the people who died, but the futures that never had enough time to become visible. Around 75,000 years ago, if the human world was already small and uneven, then every lost line mattered more. Humanity was not yet the vast species we see today. It was a fragile network of groups whose long-term survival depended on continuity across generations. What Toba may have threatened then was not only life in the present moment, but the width of the human future itself. A loss in deep human history is difficult to measure because it does not always leave a visible wound. A forest can grow back over an abandoned place. Rain can soften ash into soil. Rivers can move sediment across old surfaces. Stone tools can remain, but the people who made them are gone beyond naming. Genetic variation can disappear without leaving a sign that the eye can see. This is why the possible losses around Toba have to be imagined carefully, not as invented stories, but as categories of things that small human populations can lose when pressure becomes severe. They can lose people. They can lose connections. They can lose roots. They can lose knowledge of particular landscapes. They can lose enough births across enough seasons that one branch of ancestry ends quietly. None of these losses requires a single dramatic moment. They can unfold slowly through hunger, distance, isolation, and reduced survival of children. If the eruption darkened the climate or disturbed food systems, the cost may have appeared first as strain on ordinary life. A group that once moved between known water sources might find one of them unreliable. A plant that once marked a season might no longer return in the same way. Animals might shift their range. A familiar camp might become less useful. These changes could force movement, and movement itself was not simple. People carried children, tools, food, memory, and injury. They moved through lands that may already have belonged to other groups or presented unknown risks. If groups met, they might exchange, join, compete, or avoid one another. If they did not meet, isolation could deepen. In small populations, isolation is not only loneliness, it is a biological danger. It can reduce the number of possible partners, narrow the exchange of knowledge, and make a group more vulnerable to chance. The loss of connection may have been one of the quietest dangers after a major environmental shock. The human species survived through social life. It depended on care, learning, shared effort, and the ability of groups to remain connected enough across time. When connections break, people may still live, but the wider human web becomes thinner. That thinner web is one way to understand the fear behind only thousands survived. The danger is not only that many people may have died. The danger is that the future may have been carried forward by fewer lines, fewer links, and fewer remembered ways of living. A tool tradition might continue in one place and disappear in another. A way of reading a coast, a river valley, or a dry plain might vanish with the people who knew it. A genetic line might end because a few children did not survive through a period of scarcity. These losses do not appear as one great monument of destruction. They appear as absence. Later, humans inherit what passed through, not everything that once existed. This is important because modern humanity often feels complete to itself. We look at the present and imagine that the past was leading toward us, but deep history was not aiming at us. It was full of possible lines, many of which failed or merged or disappeared. If Toba contributed to a narrowing, then what we call human survival may also contain hidden reduction. The people who became our ancestors continued, but others may have fallen out of the future. We should not claim to know the details of those lost lives. We should not give them thoughts, names, or stories that the evidence cannot support. But we can understand the scale of what may be lost when small populations pass through stress. A species can survive and still lose much of its earlier variety. A future can continue and still become narrower than it might have been. The eruption beneath Sumatra, if it truly added pressure to the world of early humans, may have done more than threaten bodies. It may have helped decide which memories, movements, bloodlines, and local human worlds were carried forward, and which were left behind in silence. The deepest losses after an event like Toba would not all be visible in the ground. Some would survive only as missing possibilities. A genetic line that ended would not leave a sign saying it had once existed. A group that disappeared from a harsh landscape might leave only a few tools, or nothing at all. A way of knowing a river, a coastline, a dry season, or a sheltering hill might vanish when the people who carried that knowledge no longer had descendants. This is why the question of what humanity could have lost is so difficult. We are not looking only for bodies, bones, or ruins. We are looking for the shape of absence. If the eruption contributed to climate stress, and if that stress narrowed human populations, then what survived into the later world may have been only part of a wider human past. The surviving lines became the bridge to us. The lost lines became silence. This does not mean we should invent details about them. We cannot know the names of those groups, the exact routes they walked, or the precise knowledge they carried, but we can say something careful and true. In small populations, every broken line matters more. When there are few people, the loss of one group can mean the loss of a large share of local memory and genetic variation. When connections between groups weaken, survival becomes more dependent on chance. When children fail to survive across several hard seasons, the future narrows without leaving a dramatic scene behind. Toba may have been part of such a narrowing, or it may have been one severe pressure among several. Either way, it forces us to think about human survival not as a complete victory, but as a passage through selection, accident, endurance, and loss. The people who continued after that ancient period did not carry all possible human futures with them. They carried the futures that remained. That thought is quieter than the claim that a volcano almost killed everyone, but it may be more important. It means that the modern human story is built not only on survival, but also on what did not survive. The languages that would later appear, the tools that would later change, the migrations that would later spread across the planet, and the societies that would later rise all came from lines that stayed unbroken. Behind those lines may have been other lines that ended before they could become part of the later record. The ash from Sumatra does not tell us exactly which futures were lost. Genetics does not restore every vanished branch. Archaeology does not preserve every camp, every path, or every decision, but together, these fragments remind us that the early human world was not guaranteed to widen. It could have narrowed. It may have narrowed more than once. Toba stands in that wider pattern as a moment when the Earth itself may have added pressure to an already fragile species. The loss, then, is not only measured in death. It is measured in reduced variety, fewer connections, fewer surviving branches, and a smaller set of ancestral paths leading into the present. This is the hidden weight behind the phrase "only thousands survived." Whether the exact number is right or not, the fear inside it is understandable. It asks how close the human future came to being carried by too few people, in too few places, with too little margin for error. It asks how much of humanity may have disappeared before history could remember it. And it asks us to see ourselves not as the inevitable result of progress, but as descendants of those lines that happened, somehow, to pass through a dangerous opening. If Toba changed the sky, then the greater change may have happened slowly afterward, in the thinning of choices, the ending of local worlds, and the quiet survival of enough people for the human story to continue. After the ash, the human story did not begin again in a clean world. It continued through damaged landscapes, altered seasons, and the slow return of patterns that may not have returned in the same way. A great eruption can happen in days, but recovery belongs to years, generations, and places. Plants do not all come back together. Animals do not immediately return to old roots. Water may clear in one region and remain unreliable in another. Some ground may become usable again, while other areas remain poor or unfamiliar. For early human groups, the long road after the ash would have been lived through ordinary decisions made under unusual pressure. Stay or move. Follow a river or cross dry land. Remain near a coast or search inland. Keep a group together or split when food became difficult. These choices were not made with knowledge of a global event. They were made with tired bodies, living children, remembered paths, and the immediate need to survive another season. This is why the aftermath of Toba matters so deeply. The eruption itself may have been sudden, but its human effects, if severe, would have unfolded slowly through the living chain of generations. A child born after the ash would not remember the old sky. A younger adult might know only that elders spoke of seasons that had once been more predictable. A group might continue making tools, carrying fire, and following animals, while also living inside a world that had become less generous. If climate cooled or rainfall shifted, then recovery would not simply mean waiting for danger to pass. It would mean adjusting to a new balance between body and landscape. Some groups may have found that older knowledge still worked well enough. Others may have found that familiar places no longer supported them. The human line after Toba, therefore, may have moved forward through a mixture of endurance and change. It was not a return to the world before, it was a continuation into a world that may have been reshaped. This long road is important because the title can make survival sound like one moment. The volcano erupted, only thousands survived, and humanity continued. But real survival is longer than escape. To survive as a species, people had to have children, and those children had to live long enough to have children of their own. Groups had to maintain enough knowledge to find food and water. They had to remain connected enough, or become connected again, so that small populations did not fall into isolation. They had to carry tools, habits, and social care through time. A single surviving season would not be enough. The bridge to later humanity had to hold across many seasons. If the ancestral population truly narrowed, then each later generation became part of the recovery. Slowly, in some places, numbers may have grown, Groups may have spread again into landscapes that had become usable. Routes may have reopened. Contacts may have increased. New local patterns may have formed around changed environments. But this should not be imagined as a planned expansion. It was not a march toward modern humanity. It was life continuing where it could. The people after Toba did not know they were rebuilding the future. They were living inside their present, responding to hunger, weather, kinship, injury, birth, and memory. Only from far away in time can we see that their continuation mattered to all later human history. The long road after the ash reminds us that survival is not only the absence of extinction, it is the patient rebuilding of possibility. If Toba placed a heavy pressure on early humans, then the fact that humanity continued does not erase the danger. It shows that enough groups, in enough places, held the chain together. Some lines may have disappeared, some knowledge may have vanished, some regions may have emptied and later filled again, yet somewhere, across landscapes still only partly visible to science, people continue to live, move, adapt, and carry the human story beyond the ash. The long road after the ash would have been carried through children more than through dramatic survival. A group could endure the first years after an eruption, but the deeper test was whether children lived, learned, and became adults who could carry memory forward. In small populations, this kind of continuity matters more than any single moment of escape. A child who survived a hard season was not only one life saved, that child could become a future parent, a future toolmaker, a future keeper of roots, a future link between groups. If Toba created climate stress, then the years after it would have tested this chain again and again. Food had to be found often enough for pregnant women, nursing mothers, young children, injured adults, and older people who still held useful knowledge. Water had to remain reachable. Groups had to avoid becoming so isolated that chance alone could decide their future. The recovery of humanity, if there was a severe narrowing, would not have looked like a sudden rise. It would have looked like enough births, enough care, enough movement, and enough memory across many generations. This is why the aftermath of Toba connects directly to the origin of later humans. The people who lived after the eruption were not simply survivors of a disaster, they were possible ancestors. Their importance lies not only in the fact that they lived, but in the fact that some of their lines continued long enough to become part of the later human story. Around them, other lines may have ended. Some groups may have remained in one region for a time, then disappeared. Others may have moved into new landscapes and mixed with people already there. Some may have kept older habits. Some may have changed routes, diets, or tool use because the land required it. None of this needs to be imagined as sudden progress. It was adaptation under pressure, shaped by ordinary needs. A group that found a more reliable coast did not know it had chosen a path into deep ancestry. A family that crossed a dry stretch and reached water did not know that one small success might matter thousands of generations later. Yet this is how human history often works before writing. Large outcomes grow from small continuities that no one at the time can see in full. After the ash, some landscapes may have slowly recovered. Plants could return to damaged ground. Animals could move back into usable areas. Rivers and lakes could become clearer. But recovery would not have been even. A place that recovered quickly might draw people back. A place that remained poor might be avoided. A route that once connected groups might be broken for generations, then reopened. These changing conditions could shape migration without creating a single clear path. The human world after Toba may have been a world of adjustment, groups spreading when conditions allowed, retreating when they did not, meeting others, separating again, and carrying fragments of earlier knowledge into altered places. This matters because a population bottleneck, if it occurred, would not end the story at its narrowest point. The generations after the narrowing would decide whether the line widened again or failed. Survival had to become reproduction. Reproduction had to become childhood survival. Childhood survival had to become learned knowledge. Learned knowledge had to become movement, cooperation, and continued ancestry. In this sense, the long road after the ash was not only biological, it was also social. Human beings survived through dependence. They needed care during infancy, learning during youth, cooperation during hunger, and shared attention to danger. A damaged climate could strain all of these things, but it could also make them more necessary. The human line did not continue because individuals stood alone against catastrophe. It continued because enough groups remained able to hold one another through uncertainty. That is the calmer, deeper image of the world after Toba. Not humanity instantly restored, not humanity completely destroyed, but small communities moving through a changed planet, keeping enough life alive for the road ahead to remain open. The long road after the ash leads to one of the most important truths in the Toba story. Survival is not the same as recovery. A group can survive a shock and still live for generations inside its shadow. A landscape can become usable again and still not become what it was before. A population can continue and still carry the marks of narrowing, isolation, and loss. If the eruption placed heavy pressure on parts of the ancient world, then the people who lived afterward may have inherited not only life, but a smaller set of choices. Some roots may have been broken. Some neighbouring groups may no longer have been there. Some sources of food may have shifted. Some knowledge may have remained useful, while other knowledge lost its place because the land itself had changed. This is why the aftermath matters as much as the eruption. The human future would not have been secured the moment the ash stopped falling. It would have been secured slowly, if enough groups could keep moving through time without the chain breaking. In the generations after Toba, the human story may have widened again in some places. Groups could have followed rivers, coasts, grasslands, and seasonal corridors as conditions allowed. They may have entered landscapes that had been abandoned or avoided during harder years. They may have met other groups, exchanged partners, shared knowledge, or merged into new communities. They may also have separated, declined, or vanished. We should not imagine one smooth expansion. Deep human history rarely moves like a straight road. It moves through openings and closures, through local success and local failure. A wetter interval can allow movement. A dry interval can stop it. A rich coastline can support continuity. A damaged inland route can remain empty. Over time, these uneven movements could shape which human lines became ancestral to later populations. This connects the road after the ash to the larger story of Homo sapiens. Later, humans would spread widely, eventually reaching many parts of the world, but that later success should not be read backward as certainty. Around the time of Toba, the species still depended on fragile continuities. The people who carried the human line forward did not know that future continents, languages, and civilizations rested on their survival. They knew hunger, weather, children, danger, and the need to remain close enough to life-giving places. If the world after the eruption was harder, then every ordinary act became part of a larger continuation. Finding water, sharing food, keeping fire, teaching children, remembering roots, and maintaining enough connection between groups for ancestry to widen again. The ash did not end the human story, but it may have become one of the pressures through which that story had to pass. This is the careful conclusion of the long road after the ash. Toba should not be turned into a simple origin myth, as if one volcano alone created modern humanity by nearly destroying it. But it also should not be dismissed as only a distant geological event. It occurred at a time when human populations were small, scattered, and still deeply dependent on local environments. Its possible climate effects, its ash layers, and its place in the debate about population narrowing all make it part of a serious question. Did humanity nearly vanish, or did it endure a severe but uneven disturbance? Did only a small ancestral bridge carry later humans forward, or was the population wider than the strongest bottleneck stories suggest? The answer remains partly hidden. Yet the road after the ash shows why survival itself is meaningful. Somewhere, enough people lived through the difficult years, enough children grew, enough memory remained, enough groups found food, water, shelter, and one another. Whatever Toba took, it did not take everything. The human line continued beyond the darkened sky, not as a guaranteed triumph, but as a fragile thread that held long enough to become us. The reason the Toba story still matters is not that it gives us a perfect answer. It matters because it teaches us how fragile a species can be before it becomes powerful. Today, humanity looks enormous, We live across continents, change rivers, build cities, store food, record memory, and look back at ancient events through science. But around 75,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was not a force spread securely across the planet. It was a living lineage carried by small groups, local knowledge, vulnerable children, and landscapes that could change without warning. A volcano beneath Sumatra reminds us that the human future was once exposed to forces far larger than any group could understand. The ground opened in one region, but the question reaches far beyond that place. Could ash, climate stress, and ecological disruption have pushed early humans toward a dangerous narrowing? Could the later human world have come through a much smaller ancestral bridge than we usually imagine? These questions matter because they change the way we see ourselves. They move us away from the idea that human success was guaranteed. They show that our species did not rise through certainty, but through survival under limits. The value of this story also lies in its caution. It is tempting to turn Toba into a simple tale. One eruption, one dark sky, one near extinction, one small group of survivors. That version is easy to remember, but it is not careful enough. The evidence is more complicated. The eruption was real. Its ash travelled far. Its possible climate effects are serious enough to study. Some genetic interpretations suggest narrow phases in human ancestry. Yet archaeological evidence also shows that human activity continued in some regions, and the exact connection between Toba and a global human bottleneck remains debated. This uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the honest shape of deep history. When evidence comes from ash layers, stone tools, climate models, and DNA, the past does not speak in one clear sentence. It speaks in fragments. Learning to respect those fragments is part of the lesson. A truthful story can still be powerful without pretending to know more than it knows. In fact, it becomes more powerful because it shows how real knowledge is built slowly, with limits, corrections, and patience. Toba matters because it sits at the meeting point between Earth history and human ancestry. It shows that the story of our species is not only about intelligence, tools, or migration. It is also about climate, geology, chance, and the uneven survival of small communities. A change in sunlight could become a change in plants. A change in plants could become a change in animals. A change in animals could become a longer walk for a hungry group. A longer walk could decide whether children survived. In this way, the largest forces of the planet can pass quietly into the smallest details of human life. That is why the eruption remains so haunting. It does not need to be proven as the single cause of a near extinction to matter. It matters because it reveals the scale at which human survival once operated. Our ancestors were not outside nature. They were deeply inside it, dependent on water, weather, food webs, shelter, and one another. If a few places remained livable, those places could preserve the future. If enough groups stayed connected, the human line could widen again. If too many links broke, a species could become narrower without leaving a dramatic monument behind. The lesson is calm but serious. Humanity is not only the story of progress. It is also the story of thresholds survived, losses carried forward, and possibilities that disappeared before anyone could record them. The Toba question reminds us that being here now is not proof that the path here was easy. It may be proof that, in a difficult ancient world, enough people endured long enough for the next generation to begin. The Toba story matters because it shows how easily human beings can misunderstand scale. We are used to thinking of danger as something close enough to see. A wound, a storm, a hungry season, a predator, a dry stream. These are dangers that meet the body directly. But some of the deepest dangers in human history began far away, or far below, or far above ordinary perception. A volcanic system beneath Sumatra could become a change in the sky. A change in the sky could become a change in rainfall. A change in rainfall could become a change in plants, animals, movement, and birth. By the time such a chain reached a human group, the original cause might be unknowable to them. They would not need to understand the volcano to suffer its possible effects. They would only need to live in a world where familiar patterns no longer held. This is one of the most important lessons of deep history. Human life has always depended on systems larger than human sight. Climate, geology, water, migration routes and food webs formed the background of survival long before people could measure or name them. If Toba placed pressure on early humans, then it reminds us that our species was shaped not only by what people did, but by what the planet allowed. Intelligence mattered, cooperation mattered, memory mattered, tools mattered, but none of these strengths made people independent from the land. A sharp stone is useful only if the body has strength to use it. A remembered route matters only if the route still leads somewhere livable. Social care can protect a child, but care still needs food, water, warmth, and time. This is why the story should not be told as if humans simply conquered catastrophe. The better lesson is quieter. Early humans survived by remaining flexible within limits they could not control. They moved when they had to. They used different resources when possible. They depended on one another. They carried knowledge in living bodies. They endured through local worlds that were sometimes generous and sometimes harsh. The Toba question also teaches us to respect uncertainty. A dramatic title can pull attention toward a strong claim, but the evidence asks for discipline. We can say that the eruption was enormous. We can say that ash travelled far. We can say that scientists have seriously studied whether it affected climate and human population history. We can say that some models and interpretations have raised the possibility of a severe narrowing, but we should not say that every detail is settled. The number of survivors, the severity of climate effects, and the exact role of Toba in human ancestry remain difficult questions. This does not weaken the story. It gives the story its value. It allows the listener to rest inside a careful kind of wonder, where the past is not forced into certainty before the evidence is ready. The real educational value is that survival and knowledge both require patience. The ancient people who continued after Toba, if they faced serious stress, survived through repeated acts rather than one final answer. Modern science approaches their world in a similar way, through repeated evidence rather than one final dramatic claim. Ash is compared, sediments are studied, tools are placed in context, DNA is modelled, climate is reconstructed with caution. Each piece is incomplete, but together they let us approach a world that no written history can reach. And that world teaches something simple and profound. The human future was never separate from the earth. It passed through air, water, stone, hunger, care, and chance. Whether Toba nearly ended humanity or only tested it unevenly, the story reminds us that our presence today grew from fragile continuities. We are not here because the path was guaranteed. We are here because, somewhere in deep time, enough life remained connected to continue. The lasting value of the Toba story is that it makes human survival feel less like a straight road and more like a narrow passage through uncertainty. It reminds us that the beginning of our species was not protected by destiny. Homo sapiens did not move toward the present because the present was waiting. The line continued because enough people, in enough places, lived through conditions that could have broken them. A volcano beneath Sumatra may or may not have been the single cause of a severe human bottleneck, but it belongs to a larger truth that is difficult to ignore. Our ancestors lived inside a world where climate, water, food, disease, distance, and chance could shape the future more strongly than any single decision. They had intelligence, cooperation, tools, memory, and care, but they did not have control over the planet that held them. This is why the question in the title matters, even when the answer remains open. It forces us to see early humanity not as a guaranteed success, but as a vulnerable living thread. A vast eruption happened. Ash travelled. The atmosphere may have changed. Some environments may have become harder. Some groups may have continued. Some may have disappeared. Some lines may have entered the future, while others ended without a voice. That is not a simple disaster story. It is a lesson in how survival and loss can exist together. It also changes the meaning of human strength. Strength in this ancient setting was not domination. It was endurance under limits. It was the ability to adjust when a known place became uncertain. It was the ability to carry children, share food, remember roots, and keep social bonds alive when the land offered less. It was not freedom from nature. It was dependence handled carefully. The people who lived through that broad era did not know that distant descendants would one day study ash layers, sediments, tools, and DNA. They did not know that their ordinary acts would become part of a question about whether humanity nearly vanished. They were simply living. Yet from our distance, those ordinary acts become enormous. A child who survived one harsh season could become part of the bridge to later generations. A group that remained near water could keep a line alive. A memory passed from an older person to a younger one could help a community move when the old pattern failed. This is the calm message beneath the ancient catastrophe. The future often survives through small continuities that do not look historic while they are happening. The Toba question also teaches humility toward evidence. A strong title may ask whether a volcano nearly killed every human on Earth, but a truthful account must avoid pretending that the past is clearer than it is. The eruption is real. Its scale is real. The debate about human population narrowing is real, but the exact human cost remains difficult to measure. That uncertainty should not be treated as failure. It is part of honest knowledge. Deep history is not a place where every answer can be recovered. It is a place where fragments must be handled with respect. The ash does not speak alone. The tools do not speak alone. The genes do not speak alone. Together, they suggest a world where humanity may have been tested, narrowed, and preserved in uneven ways. By asking what Toba did to early humans, we are also asking what it means for any species to survive a dangerous age. The answer is not only numbers, it is continuity. Enough bodies stayed alive. Enough children grew. Enough knowledge passed forward. Enough groups remained connected or found one another again. Whatever was lost, something remained. And from that remaining thread came the later human world, still carrying within it the quiet memory of a time when survival may have been far less certain than it appears from where we stand now. At the end of the Toba story, the most honest answer is not a closed answer. It is a careful opening. A vast volcano erupted beneath what is now Sumatra. Its ash travelled across enormous distances. Its possible effects on climate have been studied seriously. Its place in the debate about human population narrowing remains one of the most haunting questions in deep prehistory. But the evidence does not allow us to say, with complete certainty, that this single eruption nearly killed every human on Earth. It also does not allow us to dismiss the danger as meaningless. The truth rests in the difficult space between those two extremes. Toba was real. The scale was extraordinary. Humanity at that time was small, scattered, and dependent on local landscapes. If the eruption darkened skies or disturbed rainfall, then it could have placed pressure on people far from the volcano itself. Yet pressure is not the same as extinction, and survival in one region does not prove safety everywhere. The ancient world was uneven. Some places may have been damaged deeply. Some may have remained livable. Some groups may have moved. Some may have endured. And some may have vanished without leaving clear evidence. That is why the title remains powerful when treated carefully. It asks us to imagine a moment when the human future may have narrowed, but it does not give us permission to pretend that every detail is known. The closer we look, the more the story becomes less about one simple catastrophe and more about the fragile structure of early human life. A volcano can enter the sky. The sky can change the land. The land can change food, water, movement, birth, and connection. Through those quiet channels, a geological event can become part of ancestry. The people alive then did not know they were living inside a question that later science would struggle to answer. They did not know that ash in distant soil would one day be compared, that DNA would be modelled, that stone tools would be placed above and below volcanic layers, or that their survival would be discussed thousands of generations later. They knew only the needs of the living world around them. A child had to be fed. A fire had to be kept, a route had to be remembered, water had to be found, a group had to stay together or move, or search for others. If the world after Toba became harder, then the future of humanity was carried through these ordinary acts. That is the quiet centre of the story. Not certainty, not spectacle, continuity. Enough people remained for the line to continue. Enough children lived. Enough memory passed forward. Enough groups found places where life was still possible. But enough does not mean all. Somewhere in the ancient world, there may have been losses we cannot see. Local groups that disappeared. Knowledge that ended. routes that were no longer walked, genetic lines that did not reach the present. The ash cannot name them, the stones cannot fully restore them, the genes cannot recover every life outside the lines that survived. What remains is a human story shaped by both endurance and absence. So when we return to the question of whether Toba nearly killed every human on Earth, leaving only thousands behind, the careful answer is that it may point toward a real vulnerability, but not a proven census. The strongest version of the claim is too simple. The deeper version is more meaningful. Around that ancient time, humanity may have been far closer to narrowness than the modern world allows us to feel. The species that now fills the planet may once have depended on scattered groups living through uncertainty under a changed sky. The story does not end with a final verdict. It asks us to keep looking at the ash, the climate, the tools, the DNA, and the silence between them. The open question beneath Toba is not only about one eruption, it is about how we read the earliest chapters of ourselves when the evidence arrives in fragments. A layer of ash can tell us that the earth changed the sky. A stone tool can tell us that someone was present before or after that change. A genetic pattern can suggest that the ancestry of later humans passed through narrow phases. A climate reconstruction can estimate cold, dryness, or disruption. But none of these pieces can stand alone as the whole story. Each one is like a small light placed over a different part of a dark landscape. Together, they show shape, but not every detail. This is why the Toba question remains alive. It is not a finished answer hidden under the ash. It is a careful conversation between geology, biology, archaeology, and time. If we ask only whether the volcano killed nearly everyone, we may miss the deeper meaning. The deeper meaning is that early humanity lived close enough to natural limits that a planetary disturbance could become part of human ancestry. The species was not yet protected by numbers, storage, technology, or global networks. It lived through bodies that needed warmth, food, water, care, and connection. It lived through children whose survival could not be assumed. It lived through groups that could become isolated by distance, hunger, drought, or fear. In that kind of world, survival was never guaranteed. It had to be renewed again and again. The Toba eruption may have been one of the great tests inside that renewal, or it may have been one severe pressure among several. Either way, the question reveals how thin the bridge to the present may once have been. When we look at modern humanity, it is easy to see only abundance. Billions of people live under lights, cities, screens, roads, farms, and records. But deep behind that abundance lies a time when the future may have depended on far fewer lives, far fewer places, and far fewer chances. This does not mean we should turn the past into a myth of near-total destruction. It means we should let the past stay difficult. Some evidence supports survival and continuity in places where a simple catastrophe story would expect emptiness. Some evidence supports the idea that human ancestry passed through serious narrowness. Some evidence suggests climate stress, while other evidence warns that the effects were not the same everywhere. The honest lesson is not that one side wins completely. The honest lesson is that early human survival was uneven, local, and vulnerable to forces larger than any group could understand. A volcano in Sumatra could matter to people who never saw Sumatra because the atmosphere connected distant worlds. But a distant effect still had to pass through local reality. Did water remain? Did plants return? Did animals move within reach? Did children survive? Did groups meet others, or become cut off? Did knowledge still fit the changed landscape? These questions are small compared with the scale of an eruption, but they are the questions through which a species survives or fails. The people who lived in that age could not know they were part of a story about humanity. They were not preserving civilization. They were preserving life. The value of this story, then, is not only in its mystery, it is in the humility it gives. We are descended from continuities we cannot fully see, and perhaps from a narrowing we cannot fully measure. The ash remains in the earth. The debate remains in science. The silence remains around the lost groups who may have lived, suffered, moved, and vanished without leaving descendants. And still, something continued. Enough life crossed the difficult passage. Enough memory remained inside living people. Enough children became adults. Enough groups found a way through the altered world. That may be the quietest truth beneath the question. Not that we know exactly how close humanity came to ending, but that the line between ending and continuing may once have been much thinner than it feels today. The last lesson of Toba is not that humanity was destined to survive. It is that survival can be real and uncertain at the same time. The eruption happened. The ash travelled. The climate may have shifted. Human groups may have faced hunger, movement, isolation, and loss in ways that can only be partly reconstructed. Some evidence points towards serious pressure. Some evidence points toward continuity. Some evidence suggests a narrow ancestral bridge. Some evidence warns us not to turn that bridge into a simple count of every living person. The truth does not become weaker because it is careful. It becomes more useful. It teaches us that deep history is not made of perfect answers, but of patient attention to what remains. Ash in soil, tools in sediments, traces in DNA, and changes in ancient climate all become pieces of a story that no one wrote down. Through them, we learn that our species was never separate from the earth. Human life depended on air, water, plants, animals, seasons, bodies, births, care, and memory. A change in one part of that living web could pass slowly into every other part. A volcano could begin beneath Sumatra and become, through the sky and the land, a question about ancestry. This does not mean the strongest version of the title is proven as a final fact. It means the title points toward a real vulnerability. Around that ancient time, Homo sapiens may have been far smaller, far more scattered, and far less secure than the modern world makes us feel. The people who carried the human line forward were not protected by numbers. They were not protected by cities, farming, writing, medicine, or stored history. They were protected only by what small groups could hold together: knowledge of place, social care, movement, endurance, and enough connection for life to continue. If the world became darker after Toba, then survival would have been made from simple things. A child kept alive through scarcity, a root remembered when a water source failed, a fire preserved through a cold night, food shared when no one had enough, a group finding another group before isolation became too deep. These acts do not look large from a distance, but without them, there would be no later distance from which to look back. Whatever was lost after Toba, something passed through. Not everything, perhaps not even most of what could have been, but enough. Enough living lines remained for later humans to spread, speak, remember, build, wonder, and ask where they came from. That is the quiet educational value of this story. It does not ask us to fear the past. It asks us to respect the fragility behind our presence. We are not here because the road was smooth. We are here because, again and again, life crossed narrow places without knowing whether the path would widen. The ash of Toba is one of those narrow places in the mind. It reminds us that history did not begin with kings, cities, or written words. It began much earlier, in bodies moving through uncertain landscapes, carrying memory from one breath to the next. The modern human world may look vast, but behind it stands a much smaller image: scattered people under a changed sky, trying to keep life going. Some of their world is visible in evidence. Much of it is gone. The lost branches cannot speak. The surviving branches became us. And so the story should end, without pretending to close what science has not closed. A volcano once opened beneath Sumatra. Its ash crossed the ancient world. Humanity continued, but perhaps through a passage far narrower than comfort allows us to imagine. If so much of who we are came through such fragile beginnings, what other parts of the human story remain hidden in the silence between survival and disappearance?